Listen, I need to tell you something that's going to sound absolutely insane. But every word? Dead serious. This happened in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, and it changed everything about how one man understood the world. You ever wonder what you'd do if something impossible showed up at your door? Not metaphorically. I mean literally impossible. Because Marcus Chen had about 30 seconds to make that choice, and what he decided that night in December. It rewrote every scientific principle he'd spent 30 years teaching. But here's where it gets really wild. This isn't just about Bigfoot. Yeah, you heard me right. This is about family, about loss, about finding purpose when you thought you had nothing left to live for. This is about a 54-year-old biology professor who thought his life was over, and the dying creature that proved him wrong. Now look, I know what you're thinking. Another Bigfoot story, right? Some grainy footage, maybe a blurry photo, bunch of speculation. Nah, this is different. This is about blood and infection and medical treatment, about a mother's desperate trust, about connections that shouldn't exist but do anyway. Before we dive into this absolutely mind-blowing story, real quick, if you're into mysteries that make you question everything you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button. We drop new stories every week that'll keep you up at night wondering what's really out there. And honestly, after you hear what happened to Marcus Chen, you're going to look at those dark woods a little differently. Trust me on that. All right, let's get into it. Because what happened that winter night when something massive started crying outside Marcus's cabin? That's just the beginning. Marcus Chen was the kind of guy who needed proof for everything. 54 years old, former biology professor, the type who'd spent 3 decades explaining to college kids why Bigfoot couldn't exist. Evolution, anatomy, the fossil record. He had all the answers, living alone in a cabin so remote that GPS just gave up trying. That was his choice after his husband David died 4 years back. The cancer took David fast, 8 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Marcus couldn't handle the sympathy looks, the empty house in Missoula, the ghost of their life together haunting every corner. So he ran, bought this cabin in the absolute middle of nowhere, maybe 80 miles from the nearest Starbucks, where the nearest neighbor was 15 miles of bad road away. The locals in Darby, tiny town, population, maybe 700 on a good day, they all had stories about these mountains. Weird howls at night, trees bent in ways that didn't make sense, footprints by the creek that were way too big, way too wide, shaped all wrong. Marcus heard it all when he'd drive down monthly for supplies. He'd smile politely, nod, pay for his groceries, and think they were all watching too much cable TV. 4 years in these mountains, and he'd never seen anything his biology textbooks couldn't explain. The thing about grief is it changes shape over time. First, it's this crushing weight that makes you question whether you want to wake up tomorrow. Then it becomes this quiet companion you carry everywhere. Marcus had made his peace with it, mostly, found purpose in the routine, chopping wood, tending his greenhouse, surviving winter after winter. Some days that was enough. Some days it had to be. His days were tight, up at 5:30 a.m., coffee brewed on the wood stove he'd learned to operate through trial and error. Check the greenhouse, chop wood for an hour, read until lunch, afternoon hike to keep his body from seizing up, dinner, more reading, bed by 9 p.m. The kind of schedule that would drive most people insane but gave Marcus structure in a life that had lost its anchor. December 23rd. That's when everything changed. Marcus had just finished dinner, venison stew from a deer he'd harvested in fall, recipe David had perfected over years. He was washing dishes, mind on nothing particular, when he heard it. Crying, deep, guttural, desperate crying, coming from somewhere outside. Not human, definitely not human, but not animal either. Something in between, something that understood loss and pain in a way that transcended species. Now, you got to understand something about winter nights in the mountains. Every sound carries, every branch that snaps, every animal that moves. You hear it all. But this was different. This was intelligent suffering. Marcus dried his hands slowly, moved to the window. The sun had set an hour ago, and the forest was that particular kind of dark you only get in mountains in winter. Absolute, consuming, the kind that makes you remember humans used to be prey. Then something moved in his clearing. His brain tried to make sense of it. A person in winter gear, a bear on its hind legs, some trick of his tired eyes. But as it stepped into the moonlight near his cabin, all those explanations crumbled. The figure stood maybe 8.5 feet tall, covered in thick, russet-brown hair that looked coarse and wild. Massive shoulders, long arms, moving with a grace that didn't match its size. The face was visible in the moonlight, more human than ape, with a flat nose, pronounced brow ridge, and eyes that caught the light with unmistakable intelligence. And in those massive arms, held careful against a chest that heaved with sobs, was something smaller, a baby, limp and motionless. Marcus stood frozen at his window, 30 years of biology education warring with what his eyes were telling him. This wasn't possible. Every credible scientist agreed Bigfoot was folklore, misidentification, wishful thinking. And yet, the creature took another step forward, and Marcus could see her more clearly now. Because this was definitely female, maternal instinct written in every line of her body. Tears tracked through the fur on her face, freezing in the cold. She was looking directly at his window, directly at him. Their eyes met across the distance, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't some dumb animal. This was a person, a mother holding her dying baby and looking at the strange creature in the wooden den for what? Help? Hope? One last desperate attempt? Here's the thing. Marcus had spent 30 years teaching biology. That meant 30 years of caring about life in all its forms. And right now, life was dying in the arms of a mother who'd run out of option. The scientist in him and the human in him had a conversation that lasted maybe 2 seconds and felt like forever. Then Marcus moved, grabbed his coat, his medical kit, because he kept one stocked, living out here alone, and stepped onto his porch. The cold hit him like a physical force, but he barely noticed. He was focused on the mother, who'd gone completely still when the door opened. Her body tensed, ready to run, but she didn't. She stayed frozen, baby clutched tight, everything about her screaming desperation. "Hey," Marcus said softly, hands visible and empty. "Hey, it's okay. I see you. I see him." The mother made a sound, low, questioning, heartbreaking. Marcus took a slow step forward. "I'm a scientist. I taught biology, studied life, all kinds of life, and I can try to help, if you let me." She probably didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone, his body language, the way he moved slow and careful like you would around any scared, hurt creature. She watched him with those 2 intelligent eyes, weighing options, making decisions. Then she did something that made Marcus's throat close up. She walked forward, each step deliberate, crossed the distance between them, and knelt in the snow at the base of his porch steps. With movements so gentle, they seemed impossible from hands that large, she laid her baby down on the wooden planks. The baby was small, maybe 3.5 feet long, covered in softer fur than its mother, dark brown like wet earth. Its chest barely moved. Even from where Marcus stood, he could smell it. Blood, infection, something desperately wrong. The mother backed away 3 steps, knelt in the snow, lowered her head, and made a sound that Marcus would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. A plea, a prayer, a mother begging a stranger to save her child. Marcus looked at the baby, looked at the mother, felt every impossible thing he'd ever believed crack wide open. Then he knelt down beside the small body and did what he'd been trained to do. The baby was burning up, fever radiating through the fur. Marcus carefully checked for breathing, shallow and rapid, not good. Pulse fast and thready. He gently moved the fur on the torso and found it immediately. A wound across the left side, maybe 7 inches long, edges inflamed and weeping pus. The surrounding area was swollen, hot, angry red, visible even under all that hair. Barbed wire. Marcus recognized the injury pattern immediately. This baby had gotten caught in some kind of fence, torn itself free, and now infection was winning. "Okay," Marcus said, more to himself than anyone. "Okay, we can work with this." He looked up at the mother, who hadn't moved, was barely breathing. "I need to take him inside. Keep him warm, clean this wound. You understand?" The mother's eyes held his. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she made that humming sound again and dipped her head once. "Yes, please. Save him." Marcus wrapped the baby carefully in his coat. Damn the cold. This kid needed warmth more than he did. Lifted him, surprised by the weight, maybe 50 pounds of solid muscle under all that fur. The baby whimpered once, a sound so small and hurt, it made Marcus's chest ache, but didn't wake up. "I got him, Mama," Marcus said, looking back at the mother. "I promise you, I'll do everything I can." The mother stood slowly, and even kneeling she was taller than Marcus. She pressed both massive hands to her chest, then extended them toward him. An offering, a gift, her heart, her trust, her only child. Marcus carried the baby inside, feeling the mother's eyes on his back the whole way. Set him down on the couch near the wood stove, started grabbing supplies. This was way beyond first aid, but he'd done field research in remote areas, knew how to work with what you had. And what he had was 30 years of biology, knowledge, basic medical training, and a desperation to not let this kid die. He glanced out the window. The mother had moved to the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. She'd sat down in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly, waiting, watching, a mother in agony, trusting her baby to a creature she should fear. "Don't worry, Mama," Marcus whispered. "I got him. We're gonna fight like hell." The baby's breathing was rapid and shallow. Tachypnea, Marcus's brain supplied automatically. Respiratory rate, probably twice what it should be. He worked methodically, the way he'd trained graduate students to approach field injuries. First priority, assess the full extent of damage. Marcus carefully trimmed away matted fur around the wound with scissors, talking softly the whole time even though the baby was barely conscious. "Easy, little guy. I know this sucks. We're gonna get you sorted out." With the area cleared, the wound revealed itself fully, worse than he'd thought. The barbed wire had cut deep into muscle tissue, maybe nicked something internal. The edges were ragged, badly infected, probably 4 or 5 days old, based on the tissue degradation. In a human, this would mean IV antibiotics, possible surgery, hospital stay. Out here, with a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, he'd have to get creative. Marcus boiled water on the stove, sterilized his supplies. His medical kit had basics: antiseptic, gauze, surgical tape, a bottle of amoxicillin he'd kept from his last bout of bronchitis. He'd also spent years studying ethnobotany, had collected local medicinal plants, yarrow for bleeding control, wild oregano for its antimicrobial properties, devil's club root. The indigenous peoples around here had used it for infections for centuries. The baby stirred when Marcus started cleaning the wound, made a sound between a whimper and a growl that was way too human. His eyes opened briefly, dark brown, almost black, but with flecks of amber that caught the lantern light. He looked directly at Marcus, with an expression that carried awareness, fear, pain, understanding. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp again. "Stay with me, buddy. Stay with me." Marcus flushed the wound with antiseptic diluted water, working as gently as he could, but thorough as hell. Removed debris, bits of bark, dirt, rust from the wire that made his stomach turn. The baby's body jerked, but he didn't regain consciousness. Fever had him deep under, which was probably merciful given what Marcus had to do next. He packed the wound with a poultice he made from crushed devil's club root, mixed with wild oregano and yarrow, bound with honey as both antimicrobial and adhesive. Traditional medicine meeting. whatever knowledge he could apply from veterinary science. He'd give the baby antibiotics, too, but dosage was pure guesswork. Probably weighed less than an adult human, but metabolism might be different. He settled on a pediatric dose and prayed he was in the right ballpark, wrapped the wound in clean gauze, secured it with surgical tape and strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. The baby's breathing was still labored, but maybe marginally less frantic. Marcus covered him with every blanket he owned, kept the fire burning hot. Fever needed to break, but shock from hypothermia was just as dangerous. Outside, through the window, the mother still sat in the snow. Hadn't moved an inch, just watching the cabin like her entire existence depended on what was happening inside. Marcus grabbed a thermos of warm water and some dried venison, stepped out onto the porch. The cold slapped him hard after the warmth inside. The mother's head snapped up, body tensing, but she didn't stand. "He's alive," Marcus called out softly. "Fever's high, infection's bad, but he's fighting." The mother made a sound, low, questioning, breaking at the edges. Marcus set the water and food on the porch railing. "I don't know if you eat meat, or if you can even digest what I eat, but you should take something. You've been out here for who knows how long, and you're no good to him if you collapse." The mother stood slowly, and damn, standing, she was impressive. Had to be 8.5, maybe 9 feet tall, built like she could tear through trees without trying. She took a few steps closer, stopped at the base of the porch steps. In the moonlight filtering through clouds, Marcus could see her more clearly. The face was broad, more ape-like than human, but with features that held expression: worry, fear, exhaustion, hope. She reached down, grabbed a handful of snow, and placed it carefully on the bottom step. Then she touched her chest, touched the snow, pointed at the cabin. Marcus had to think for a second, then understood. She was asking if he needed anything, if she could help. "Just stay close," Marcus said, throat tight. "He might need you. Might need to know you're here." The mother made that humming sound again, deeper this time. Then she did something that made Marcus question everything he thought he knew about intelligence and communication. She nodded, actually nodded. A gesture of understanding that crossed every supposed boundary between their species. Marcus stood there on his porch, exhausted and freezing, watching a creature that science said didn't exist acknowledge his words with body language he recognized in his bones. 30 years teaching evolution, and none of it had prepared him for this. For intelligence looking back at him from a face that wasn't human but wasn't exactly not human either. The mother retreated to her spot at the tree line, settled back into her vigil. Marcus went inside, heart hammering, mind racing through everything he thought he knew about primates, about hominids, about what was possible in the natural world. The baby hadn't moved. Marcus settled into the chair beside the couch, monitoring breathing, checking pulse every few minutes, replacing the compress on his forehead with cool water. Talked to him in English and broken Spanish. David had been fluent, had tried to teach Marcus for years, saying whatever came to mind. "Your mama's out there waiting for you, kid. Been out there in the cold this whole time because she loves you that much. That's something. You know, that kind of love, universal. Crosses every damn line we draw." He paused, voice cracking. "You gotta fight. Show her you're strong. Show her all this was worth it." Around 2 a.m., the baby started seizing. Full tonic-clonic, body rigid, limbs jerking, jaw clenched so tight. Marcus was terrified he'd crack teeth. Febrile seizure, fever too high, brain misfiring. Marcus had seen it in fieldwork, but never had to manage it alone with a creature he couldn't even identify scientifically. He grabbed more cold water, worked frantically to bring the temperature down, held the thrashing body so the baby wouldn't hurt himself on the couch frame, fought the panic rising in his chest because he'd seen seizures that didn't stop, had read about status epilepticus and brain damage and death. Come on, please." The seizure lasted 75 seconds that felt like 75 hours. When it finally stopped, the baby went completely limp. For one terrible moment, Marcus couldn't find a pulse. Then he felt it, faint, thready, but there. He looked out the window. The mother was standing now, pressed against a tree, her body language screaming distress. She'd heard, she knew. Marcus met her eyes through the glass and shook his head slowly. Not gone, but close. Too close. The sound the mother made, low, broken, hopeless, was the worst thing Marcus had ever heard. Worse than the call telling him David had collapsed. Worse than anything human grief had ever produced. It was the sound of a mother facing the unthinkable. "Screw this," Marcus muttered. He grabbed his coat, went to the door, opened it. "Mama, you hear me?" The mother looked up, her massive form trembling. "He's still alive. You understand? Still breathing, still fighting. But I need you to believe that. Need you to hold on to that. Because..." Marcus's voice broke. Because kids know. They feel what their parents feel. And if you give up out there, he's gonna feel that in here. So you stay strong, and I'll stay strong, and we're gonna drag this kid through tonight together. Deal? The mother stared at him for a long moment. Then she straightened up, wiped her face with one huge hand, and nodded once. Firm, determined. "That's right. We don't kid." Marcus went back inside, back to the baby's side. Refreshed the poultice, adjusted the blankets, dripped more water into his mouth whenever he'd swallow. Sang songs David used to sing, old folk tunes, off-key and half-forgotten, but better than silence. And he prayed to whatever forces might be listening, evolution, entropy, the universe itself, asking for this one impossible thing to survive. One impossible night. Dawn came slow and grey, light creeping reluctant through heavy clouds. Marcus hadn't slept, running on coffee and adrenaline and sheer stubborn refusal to let this baby die on his watch. The fever hadn't broken, but it had plateaued. The baby's breathing was still shallow but marginally more stable. Progress. Maybe. Possibly. Marcus stepped outside as the sun rose, exhausted down to his DNA. The mother was still there, covered in fresh snow, frosted like a statue. When she saw him, she stood so fast. She stumbled, made a sound that was pure desperate question. Marcus managed a tired smile. He made it through the night. The mother's whole body sagged with relief. She made a series of soft sounds, not quite words, but definitely communication, gratitude and hope, and questions Marcus couldn't fully parse but understood anyway. "He's not out of the woods yet," Marcus said, then laughed at his own pun. "But he's fighting. Your boy's a fighter." The mother approached the cabin slowly, stopped at the porch steps, knelt down. She placed something on the bottom step, a bundle of roots, bark, and moss, carefully arranged like an offering. Marcus picked it up, examined it with his biologist's eye. Recognized some, devil's club, cedar bark, both with known medicinal properties. Others he didn't know but suspected were antimicrobial. She'd brought medicine, her medicine. Knowledge passed down through generations of her people. "Thank you," Marcus said, emotion thick in his voice. "I'll use these, I promise." The mother touched her chest, then reached out slowly, palm up. Marcus understood the gesture. Trust, connection, something deeper than words. Without thinking about how insane this was, he stepped forward and placed his hand in hers. Her hand was massive, rough with calluses, warm despite the cold. She closed her fingers gently around his hand, could have crushed every bone without effort, but held him like something precious and fragile. Her eyes were wet, but different now. Not despair. Gratitude. Recognition. Connection. They stayed like that for a long moment. Human and Bigfoot. Hands clasped. Everything Marcus thought he knew about the world, rearranging itself in real time. Then she let go, stepped back, and melted into the forest like smoke. Marcus stood there holding the bundle of roots, hands still tingling, wondering if he'd just participated in the most significant moment of interspecies communication in human history, or if isolation had finally broken his brain completely. The baby's soft sound from inside answered that question. This was real. All of it. Marcus went back to work. Used some of the roots the mother brought, grinding them into paste with a mortar and pestle he'd brought for plant specimens. Mixed them with his own remedies, combining indigenous knowledge with Western medicine, bridging traditions that had never been meant to meet. The poultice he created was thick, dark, smelled like the forest floor after rain. Applied it carefully to the wound, which looked marginally better, less angry, edges maybe starting to knit. Gave the baby another dose of antibiotics. Kept him warm, kept him hydrated, kept vigil like he was conducting the most important experiment of his life, because he was. This wasn't just about saving one baby. It was about everything, about whether compassion could cross the most impossible boundaries, about whether science and wonder could coexist, about whether a middle-aged biology professor who thought he'd lost his purpose could still matter in the world. Day 2 was a blur. The baby woke up a few times, eyes clearer but still confused and scared. Each time, Marcus talked to him softly, let him know he was safe, gave him water with honey dissolved in it. The baby would look at him with those two aware eyes, then drift back into fevered sleep. The mother came to the edge of the clearing 3 times that day. Each time, Marcus would step out and give her an update. They developed a system. Marcus would hold up fingers for the baby's temperature, point to his own chest and breathe slow or fast to indicate respiratory rate. The mother would respond with sounds Marcus was learning to interpret. Low hum meant acknowledgement, higher pitch meant concern. That rumbling growl meant gratitude so deep it didn't have words. By the 3rd day, something shifted. The baby woke up and stayed awake for almost an hour. His eyes tracked Marcus as he moved around the cabin, awareness sharpening. When Marcus brought him water, he drank without help, even lifted his head on his own. Small victories that felt monumental. Hey there, tough guy, Marcus said, settling beside him. Welcome back to the land of the living. The baby made a soft grunt, tried to sit up, winced from the pain, settled back down. But he was looking at Marcus now, with focus, not fever confusion. Your mama's outside, Marcus told him. She's been there every single day, waiting for you. Never left. You know that? That's love, kid. Real as anything in the world. The baby's eyes went to the window. He made a sound, not quite a word, but clearly a call. Outside, Marcus heard an answering call, joyful and breaking at once. Yeah, she hears you. She knows you're okay. Marcus changed the bandage. The wound looked better, significantly better. Inflammation decreasing, no new pus, edges definitely starting to close. The combination of medicines was working, or maybe just the baby's own immune system, finally getting ahead of the infection. He reapplied the poultice, gave another dose of antibiotics. The baby watched everything Marcus did with intense curiosity. This scientist in miniature, studying the weird creature that had saved him. You're gonna have one hell of a scar, Marcus told him. But scars are just proof you survived something that tried to kill you. Wear it proud. The baby tilted his head, trying to parse meaning from tone, if not words. Then he did something that made Marcus's heart flip. He reached out one small hand and touched Marcus's arm. Gently, deliberately. A gesture of connection, of thanks, of something that transcended the impossibility of this entire situation. Oh, buddy, Marcus whispered, covering the small hand with his own. You're so welcome. You're so welcome. That night, the mother came closer than ever before, stood just at the porch steps, looking through the window at her baby sleeping peacefully. Marcus opened the door slowly, kept his movements calm. You want to come in? See him up close? The mother hesitated, looked at the cabin, at Marcus, at the doorway that was definitely too small for her. Then she shook her head slowly, made a soft sound. Marcus nodded. I get it. This is my space, and you're respecting that. But he's doing good, Mama. Really good. Another few days, and he'll be ready to go home. The mother reached into a pouch Marcus hadn't noticed before, woven from plant fibers, hanging at her side, and pulled out something small, held it out. It was a carving, maybe 3 inches tall, made from wood, and shaped into something that looked like a bird mid-flight. The detail was incredible, every feather visible, the curve of wings catching motion. Art. She'd made art. For me? Marcus asked, taking it carefully. The mother nodded, made a sound, pointed at Marcus, pointed at the carving. Gift. Friendship. Thanks. Connection deeper than either of them could fully express. This is beautiful, Marcus said, emotion choking his voice. Thank you. I'll treasure this forever. The mother touched her own chest, then pointed at Marcus's heart. Same species, or not, we understand each other. Then she turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Marcus standing in the cold holding a carved bird that proved everything he'd believed about the world was incomplete. By day 5, the baby could sit up on his own. By day 6, he was trying to stand, wobbling on legs that were still weak, but getting stronger by the hour. Marcus fed him mashed berries mixed with honey, bits of dried venison, whatever he had that might work for a young, omnivorous primate. The baby ate like he was starving, which he probably was, and his eyes got brighter with each meal. He started following Marcus around the cabin, limping but determined. When Marcus chopped wood, he'd sit on the porch and watch. When Marcus cooked, he'd creep closer, fascinated by fire and the smell of food. He made sounds, chirps and grunts and soft hoots, that might have been baby babble or might have been actual language Marcus couldn't understand. Marcus talked to him constantly, carrying on one-sided conversations that made the cabin feel less empty than it had in years. You know what I think? I think you're going to grow up to be someone important in your family. Probably going to be a leader or something. The way you're always watching, always learning, trying to figure out how everything works. You've got that scientist brain going on. The baby carefully placed a piece of firewood on the stack, looked at Marcus for approval. Perfect. You're a natural. The mother still came every evening, and now the baby would see her through the window and make excited sounds, pressing his face against the glass. They'd call back and forth, mother and child, speaking in a language older than anything Marcus had ever studied, full of meaning he could feel, even if he couldn't translate. Sometimes Marcus would just watch them, tears streaming down his face, thinking about David and how much he would have loved this. How David would have seen the poetry in this moment, would have understood what Marcus was only beginning to grasp. That intelligence came in forms we weren't trained to recognize. That family was a force that transcended species. That love was the most universal language in existence. On day 7, reality came crashing back. Marcus woke to absolute silence. Not the normal forest silence, but something heavier, more ominous. The kind of quiet that meant every animal in the area had gone into hiding because predators were near. He looked out the window. His stomach dropped. There were men in his clearing, 6 of them, spread out in tactical formation, all wearing unmarked tactical gear. Not hunters, not forest service. These were contractors, professional, organized, moving with precision that meant serious training, and they all carried tranquilizer rifles with scopes that probably cost more than Marcus's entire cabin. The baby was still asleep on the couch, recovering body needing rest. Marcus's mind raced. These guys had found them somehow, and this time they'd brought an entire team. One of the men, tall, buzz-cut, leader type, pulled out what looked like a military-grade thermal scanner, pointed it at the cabin. Marcus saw his expression change. Target acquired. Shit. Marcus moved fast. Grabbed the baby, wrapped him in blankets tight. The baby woke up, made a questioning sound, but Marcus shushed him gently. We gotta be quiet now. Buddy. Real quiet. It's hide and seek time. He moved to the root cellar, built by the previous owner, a paranoid survivalist who'd wanted an escape route. Small, cramped, dark, but hidden under a rug in the corner. Marcus had used it for food storage, never thinking he'd need it for anything else. Climbed down the ladder with the baby clinging to his back, surprisingly strong for someone who'd been dying a week ago, settled him in the corner, covered him with every blanket he could grab from above. Stay here, no matter what you hear. Stay quiet, understand? The baby's eyes were huge, scared, but he nodded. Smart kid, he understood danger. Marcus climbed back up, closed the hatch, replaced the rug, tried to make everything look normal. Then he stepped outside before they could breach his home, because at least out here he could control the confrontation. "Morning," he called out, voice steady despite his hammering heart. "Bit early for visitors." The tall one approached, rifle lowered but ready. "Dr. Chen, we've been monitoring this area. We have reason to believe you're harboring an endangered specimen." "Specimen?" Marcus felt anger rise, sharp and hot. "You mean a living creature? An intelligent being? Because that's what we're talking about here, right? Not a specimen, a person." "Sir, we don't have time for philosophical debates. We have thermal confirmation of a large primate in your residence. We need to retrieve it before." "Before what?" Marcus stepped forward. "Before you can cage it, study it, turn it into a goddamn science project. I'm a biologist. Spent 30 years teaching evolution, biodiversity, conservation. You know what I learned? That intelligence deserves respect, regardless of its form." Two of the men started moving toward the cabin. Marcus blocked the door. "You're not going in my house, Dr. Chen. Don't make this difficult. We have authorization. Authorization from who? Show me a warrant. Show me federal credentials. Show me anything that gives you legal right to be on my property threatening me and hunting endangered species." The tall one's expression hardened. "This is above your clearance level. Now step aside." "No." For a moment, everything hung in balance. 6 armed men against 1 middle-aged professor protecting a baby that shouldn't exist. Marcus knew how this ended if it came to force. But David's voice echoed in his head, something he'd said years ago about ethics. Sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same. And sometimes you just gotta choose right. The tall one nodded to his team. 2 men grabbed Marcus's arms, pulled him away from the door. He fought, kicked, struggled, channeled every ounce of fury he'd been holding since David died, since the world took everything good and left him alone. "Get the hell off me. You have no right." They zip-tied his hands, sat him on the porch steps with 1 guard. The others went inside. Marcus heard them moving through his cabin, opening cabinets, checking closets, pulling up floorboards. "Don't find it. Please don't find the cellar." His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might crack ribs. The baby was right there, hidden under a rug, maybe 15 feet from where these men were searching. If they found him, "Sir, we've got nothing," one of the men called out. No sign of the target. The tall one's jaw tightened. Thermal showed clear signature. Check everywhere. Under the floor. In the walls. Everywhere. They searched for 30 minutes, getting increasingly frustrated. Checked the loft, the shed outside, even the damn outhouse. But the root cellar had been built by someone who knew how to hide things. No obvious seams, insulated enough to dampen thermal signatures, designed to be invisible. They weren't finding it. Finally, the tall one stood in front of Marcus, radio in hand. Target. Not at this location. Continuing search pattern. Moving northeast. He crouched down, got in Marcus's face. "Dr. Chen, that creature is valuable. Worth millions in the right markets. You're protecting it. We know you are. But we will find it. And when we do, you'll be charged with obstruction, theft of federal property, and about 15 other things I'll invent if I have to." Marcus met his eyes. "You know what's valuable? The fact that something in these mountains has survived despite everything humanity's done to destroy it. The fact that intelligence exists in forms we never acknowledged. The fact that a mother loved her baby enough to trust the impossible. That's valuable. Not whatever dollar amount you've put on a living being's head." The man stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up, cut Marcus's zip ties. "We'll be back. Count on it." They left without another word, trucks disappearing down the dirt road in a convoy of failed mission and wounded pride. Marcus waited until he couldn't hear engines anymore. Waited another 10 minutes to be absolutely sure. Then he went inside, locked every door, and opened the root cellar. The baby was curled in the corner exactly where Marcus had left him, shaking, eyes huge with fear. When he saw Marcus, he made a soft crying sound and reached up. "I know, buddy. I know. But you did so good. So good." He pulled the baby out, held him close while he trembled. Outside, Marcus heard a sound, the mother, calling from deep in the forest. She'd watched everything, been forced to hide while strangers invaded her baby's sanctuary. Unable to help without revealing herself, Marcus carried the baby to the window. The mother was at the tree line, her body language screaming anguish and rage. "He's okay," Marcus called. "They're gone. He's safe." But even as he said it, Marcus knew the truth. This place wasn't safe anymore. The men knew something was here. They'd be back with better equipment, more resources, warrants real or fabricated. They wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. The baby couldn't stay. That night, Marcus made the hardest decision since David's funeral. He'd spent a week saving this baby, bonding with him, letting himself care about something again, and now he had to let him go before caring turned into getting him captured. He packed supplies with shaking hands, the rest of his antibiotics, the medicinal herbs, bandages, dried food, water purification tablets, put them in a waterproof bag designed for backpacking. The baby watched him with those two aware eyes, and Marcus knew he understood something was changing. "You got to go home, buddy," Marcus said, voice breaking. "Back to your family, deep in the mountains, where those men can't find you, you understand?" The baby made a sad sound, pressed against Marcus's leg. "I know. I'm gonna miss you too. More than you could possibly know. But staying here? That's not safe anymore. And your mama? She needs you. She's been waiting so long." Marcus opened the door just before dawn. The mother was already there, like she'd been waiting for this moment, knowing it was coming. For a long time, the three of them just stood there in the pre-dawn darkness. Then Marcus knelt down, hugged the baby one last time. The baby clung to him, made sounds that might have been his version of crying, and Marcus let his own tears fall freely. "You be good for your mama, okay? Grow up strong. Stay hidden. Stay safe. And maybe remember the weird human who bandaged you up and talked too much." He stood up, gently guided the baby toward the porch edge. The mother stepped forward slowly, knelt down at the base of the steps. The baby looked between them, his mother and his savior, torn between two worlds. Then he made his choice. He moved to his mother, and she scooped him up with movements so gentle they defied her size, held him close, rocking him like parents have rocked children since the beginning of time. She made sounds, deep, complex, full of joy and relief and love so vast it made the mountains seem small. Marcus handed her the bag of supplies. For his wound, keep it clean, keep changing the bandages. The antibiotics, 1 pill every day until they're gone. And the salve, that's for... The mother reached out, placed one massive hand on Marcus's shoulder, squeezed gently. Then she pulled something from her pouch, a necklace made of carved wood and stone, intricate beyond anything Marcus had seen, beautiful beyond description. He took it with shaking hands. "I can't. This is too much." But the mother was already backing away, baby secure in her arms. She made one last sound, low, melodic, meant just for Marcus. "Thank you, family. Never forgotten." Then she turned and walked into the forest, her baby's arms wrapped tight around her neck, both of them disappearing into the trees like they'd never existed at all. Marcus stood on his porch as the sun rose, the necklace heavy around his neck, the carved bird from before clutched in his hand. The cabin felt empty now, hollowed out. Like purpose had walked out the door along with a baby Bigfoot and wasn't coming back. He went inside, cleaned up the evidence, burned the bloody bandages, scrubbed the floor. put everything back exactly as it had been before. A dying baby appeared and changed everything. Made his cabin look like nothing impossible had happened here. But the necklace around his neck and the ache in his chest said otherwise. 3 days after the baby left, Marcus couldn't sleep. He'd lie in the loft, staring at the ceiling, mind replaying every moment. The mother's desperate eyes, the baby's small hand touching his arm, that last hug before they disappeared into the forest. The cabin felt wrong now, too quiet, like something essential had been extracted, and the walls knew it. He tried to get back into his routine, chopping wood, checking the greenhouse, cataloging plant specimens. But his heart wasn't in it. Everything felt hollow, mechanical, like he was just going through motions while the real Marcus was somewhere else entirely. The men came back on day 4, just like they'd promised. Same trucks, same tactical gear, more equipment this time. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced thermal imaging, the kind of tech that cost government-level money. They searched his property for 6 hours, tore through his shed, checked every inch of the cabin, including the root cellar they finally found. Empty, all of it empty. The tall one stood in Marcus's doorway, frustration carved into every line of his face. "Where is it, Dr. Chen? Where's what? Don't play games. The thermal signature, the evidence we collected, something was here." Marcus met his eyes, steady and calm. "You're looking for Bigfoot in Montana in 2025. You realize how that sounds, right? Maybe your equipment malfunctioned. Maybe you saw a bear, a moose, hell. Maybe my wood stove threw off your readings. But there's nothing here except an old professor trying to live out his retirement in peace. We found hair samples, analyzed them. Unknown primate, possibly Gigantopithecus adjacent. Then publish your findings," Marcus said. "Submit them for peer review. I'm sure the scientific community would be fascinated." "Oh wait, you can't, because you're not scientists. You're hunters, and whatever you think you're looking for, it's long gone." The man stared at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out a card, dropped it on the table. "When you're ready to talk, call me. The offer stands. Cooperation means compensation. Obstruction means prosecution." They left. Marcus burned the card in his wood stove and went back to pretending his life made sense. But the forest remembered. Nature kept receipts. A week after the baby left, Marcus found the first gift. He stepped out for his morning coffee, and there it was, sitting on the old stump at the edge of the tree line. A flat stone, and on top of it, a small pile of items arranged with clear intention. Clean moss, 3 perfect pine cones, a cluster of winterberries still on their branch. Not random, deliberate. An offering. Marcus stood there holding his coffee, staring at this impossible thing, feeling his throat get tight. They were alive, they were safe, and they were saying thank you. He didn't touch the gift, just looked at it for a long time. Then he whispered, "You're welcome, buddy. Stay safe out there." 3 days later, another gift. This time it was different. A small carved figure, maybe 4 inches tall, made from wood and shaped into something that looked like a human. Simple, but recognizable. The proportions were slightly off, like it had been carved by someone learning human anatomy from observation rather than study. It was Marcus. They'd carved Marcus. He picked it up with shaking hands, traced the details with his fingers. The figure wore something approximating a coat, held something that might have been a medical bag. They'd captured him in the act of helping, frozen in wood, a moment of compassion made permanent. "Oh, kid," Marcus said to the empty forest. "You're gonna make me cry out here." The gifts kept coming. Every few days, something new would appear on the stump. A woven grass bracelet that fit Marcus's wrist perfectly. A smooth river stone with a hole through it, strung on plant fiber. A bundle of useful herbs Marcus recognized from his ethnobotany studies. Each one a message, a thank you, a reminder that some connections didn't end just because distance separated you. Marcus started leaving gifts too. He'd carve small figures of his own, nowhere near as skilled as theirs, but honest attempts. Animals he'd seen, trees from the property, once a rough approximation of what he thought the baby might look like as an adult. He'd leave them on the stump along with food he thought they might eat. Dried fruits, nuts, honey in sealed containers. They developed a system. Marcus would leave something, and within a day or two it would be gone, replaced by something new. Silent communication across species, across impossible boundaries, proving that gratitude and friendship didn't require shared language. The men came back twice more over the following weeks, each time with less conviction, more frustration. Whatever trail they'd been following had gone cold. The Bigfoot family had vanished into the deep wilderness, smart enough to avoid detection, protected by terrain that had hidden their people for millennia. Eventually, the men stopped coming. Marcus figured they'd moved on to other leads, other impossible creatures to hunt. Or maybe their funding dried up, or their bosses decided chasing cryptids in Montana winter wasn't cost-effective. Either way, his mountain went quiet again, but Marcus wasn't alone anymore. Not really. February turned into March, snow melting into mud season, revealing the forest floor beneath. Marcus spent his days hiking farther than he had in years, exploring territories he'd previously avoided. He told himself he was collecting plant specimens, observing spring emergence patterns, doing field work. Really, he was looking for signs, tracks, tree breaks, anything that might tell him his family, because that's how he thought of them now, was still out there and thriving. He found evidence everywhere once he knew what to look for. Footprints near the creek, but placed deliberately in rocky areas that wouldn't hold clear impressions. Tree structures that looked natural unless you understood the pattern. Deer remains that had been processed in ways consistent with tool use. Bones cracked for marrow, hides removed cleanly, nothing wasted. They were ghosts, moving through their territory with skill that came from generations of avoiding human detection. But they left just enough signs for Marcus to follow, like breadcrumbs meant for someone who cared enough to look. One afternoon in late March, Marcus was hiking maybe 5 miles from his cabin when he found something that stopped him cold. A tree with bark stripped away about chest high and carved into the exposed wood, clear as day, a symbol. 2 figures, one large and one small, holding hands. And beside them, a third figure, roughly human-shaped, standing with them, a family portrait. And he was in it. Marcus stood there in the mud and melting snow, pack heavy on his shoulders, and broke down completely. Just sat on a fallen log and sobbed, all the grief and loneliness and fear and love he'd been holding for 4 years, pouring out in gasping breaths that echoed through empty forest. He cried for David, for the life they'd planned and never got to finish. Cried for the baby who'd shown up dying and taught him that purpose could find you in the strangest ways. Cried for the mother who'd trusted him with the most precious thing in her world. Cried for himself, for the man who'd thought he was done caring about anything and discovered he'd been wrong. When he finally pulled himself together, the sun was setting and he had a long hike back, but he felt lighter, cleaner, like something that had been infected in his soul had finally drained and could start healing. He touched the carving gently. "I miss you too, buddy. Every damn day." Spring came proper in April, the mountains exploding with life. Marcus threw himself into his work. Real work this time, not just survival maintenance. He started documenting everything he'd observed about the Bigfoot family. Not for publication, he'd never betray their trust like that, but for himself. To prove it had happened, to process what it meant. He filled notebooks with observations, drew sketches from memory, wrote detailed descriptions of behavior that suggested complex social structure, tool use, possibly even language, analyzed the gifts they'd left, trying to understand their cultural significance, compared them to primate behavior he'd studied in grad school, to indigenous art forms from the region, trying to bridge understanding across impossible gaps. It was the most engaged he'd been with science in years. This wasn't teaching from textbooks or grading papers or publishing to maintain tenure. This was pure inquiry, driven by wonder and respect, the kind of work that had made him fall in love with biology in the first place. Late April brought something new. Marcus was sitting on his porch at sunset when he heard it. Calls in the distance, rolling through the valley. Multiple voices, complex patterns, definitely communication. He'd heard them before, but never this close, never this clearly. He sat perfectly still, listening. The calls went back and forth, varying in pitch and duration, carrying information he couldn't decode but could feel in his bones. Family talking to family, coordinating, sharing, connecting across the vast wilderness. Then one call came from much closer, maybe half a mile out, higher pitched than the others, younger. And it held a pattern Marcus recognized. Rising tone, short burst, repeated 3 times. The baby. That was the baby's call. Marcus stood up slowly, heart hammering, called back the only way he knew how, cupped his hands around his mouth and hooted, mimicking the pattern as best he could. Felt ridiculous, like a middle-aged professor playing at being an ape, but did it anyway. Silence. Then, the call came back. Same pattern, louder, closer. Holy shit. They were talking to him. Marcus called again, putting everything he had into it. Joy, recognition, missing you, thinking of you. Whether the baby could understand emotional content in vocalizations, he had no idea, but it felt right to try. Another call, even closer now. And then, movement at the tree line. Marcus's breath caught. The baby stepped into view. Except he wasn't really a baby anymore. He'd grown, shot up maybe 6 inches, filled out through the shoulders and chest. Still young, still smaller than an adult, but strong, healthy, thriving. They stood there looking at each other across the clearing, human and Bigfoot, separated by maybe 60 feet, and every law of biology Marcus had ever taught. The baby's fur was clean, well-groomed, his movement confident. The wound Marcus had treated was invisible under all that hair, just a memory now, a scar hidden beneath healthy tissue. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said softly. "Look at you. You grew." The baby made a sound, low, rumbling, happy. Then he did something that made Marcus's heart stop. He raised his right hand, palm forward. The gesture Marcus had taught him while he was healing, the universal sign for hello, for peace, for I see you. Marcus raised his own hand, mirroring the gesture. "I see you too." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands raised in mutual acknowledgement. Then the baby lowered his hand, touched his chest, pointed at Marcus. "You, friend, family." "Yeah," Marcus said, voice breaking. "Family." The baby turned and bounded back into the forest with grace that hadn't existed when he was injured, strength that came from being home and safe and loved. But before he disappeared completely, he looked back one more time, made one last sound that Marcus felt more than heard. "Thank you. Remember. Love." Then he was gone, swallowed by trees and shadows, leaving Marcus standing on his porch crying happy tears for the first time in 4 years. That night, Marcus slept better than he had since David died. Had dreams full of forest sounds and impossible creatures, and connections that transcended every boundary humans had invented. Woke up feeling lighter, purposeful, alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. The gifts continued through spring and into summer, sometimes practical, useful herbs, smooth stones that were perfect for sharpening tools, sometimes artistic, more carvings, woven items of stunning complexity, once a necklace strung with what Marcus eventually identified as eagle feathers, which meant someone had either found them naturally or had access to birds of prey in ways that suggested incredible climbing ability. Marcus responded with his own offerings, carved more figures, getting better with practice. Left honey and dried fruits he knew they liked. Once, he left a small mirror wrapped in leather, curious whether they'd react to their own reflections, what that might suggest about self-awareness. The mirror disappeared within a day. A week later, Marcus found a carved figure of a Bigfoot looking into a small reflective surface made from polished stone. They'd understood what the mirror was for, had carved themselves using it, had shown him they possessed self-recognition, self-awareness, theory of mind, abstract thought. Every gift, every interaction, added data points to the most significant anthropological discovery in human history. And Marcus kept it all secret, protected it like the precious thing it was, because some knowledge was too dangerous to share with a world that would cage it for profit. Summer brought longer days, warmer weather, more opportunities to explore. Marcus pushed deeper into the wilderness, following game trails into territories he'd previously considered inaccessible. He told himself he was being careful, staying safe, but really he was hoping to catch another glimpse, another sign, another moment of connection. June 17th changed everything again. Marcus was maybe 8 miles from his cabin, farther than he usually ventured, following a creek upstream into a canyon he'd never explored. The forest here was old growth, trees that had been standing since before Europeans arrived, the kind of wilderness that felt primordial and sacred. He was collecting water samples, still maintaining his cover of legitimate scientific work, when he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Multiple voices. Not calls like he'd heard before, but something closer to conversation. Complex vocalizations with clear structure, rhythm, meaning. Language. They had language. Marcus moved carefully, quietly, following the sound upstream. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to respect boundaries he was probably crossing. But the scientist in him, the teacher who'd spent 30 years studying communication and social behavior, couldn't resist. He found a position behind a fallen log, partially concealed by ferns, with a clear view of the creek bank ahead. What he saw redefined everything. There were 7 of them. The mother and baby he knew, plus 5 others, 2 adult males, 1 more adult female, 2 juveniles slightly older than the baby Marcus had saved. They were sitting in a rough circle near the water, clearly engaged in some kind of group activity. One of the adult males was demonstrating something, breaking open a rock to reveal the sharp edge inside, then using it to process plant material. The others watched closely, occasionally making sounds that seemed like questions or comments. He'd answer, repeat the demonstration, show them alternative techniques. Teaching. They were teaching. The baby Marcus had saved was sitting between his mother and one of the juveniles, watching intently, occasionally trying the technique himself with smaller rocks. When he succeeded in creating a usable edge, the mother made a sound, approval, pride, and touched his shoulder gently. Marcus watched for almost an hour, barely breathing, documenting everything with mental notes, since he'd stupidly left his journal at camp. He observed tool creation, food processing, what looked like planning for some future activity based on gestures and sounds. Saw affection exchanged through touches and sounds. Saw conflict resolved. One juvenile tried to take the baby's rock. The mother intervened with sounds that were clearly scolding, and the juvenile backed off immediately. Social structure, education, conflict resolution. Everything that defined human culture existed here in a form he was only beginning to understand. Then the baby looked up and saw him. Marcus froze. The baby froze. For one terrible moment, Marcus was sure he'd just destroyed everything, crossed a line that would end their fragile connection. The baby made a sound, alert, but not alarm. The mother's head snapped around, eyes locking on Marcus's position. He could see her body tense, ready to protect, ready to fight if necessary. Marcus slowly raised both hands, palms forward. Peace, friend, remember me. The baby stood up, made more sounds, pointing at Marcus, then touching his own side where the wound had been. Explaining, Marcus realized, telling them, "This is the one who helped me." The group went still, all eyes on Marcus now. He stayed frozen, hands raised, heart hammering, acutely aware that he was a single fragile human surrounded by 7 creatures that could tear him apart without effort. The mother stood slowly, walked toward him with deliberate steps, stopping maybe 10 feet away. They stared at each other, woman and man, Bigfoot and human, mothers who'd fought together to save a life. She made a sound. Deep, complex, clearly a question. Marcus tried to answer in their language, made the best approximation he could of their vocalizations. Probably butchered it, but he tried. The mother tilted her head. Then she did something Marcus would never forget. She smiled, not a human smile, but unmistakable nonetheless. Lips pulling back slightly, eyes crinkling, expression that conveyed warmth and humor. She'd understood. He tried to speak their language, probably failed hilariously, and she found it endearing. She turned back to the group, made more sounds. Extended conversation Marcus couldn't follow, but felt the general meaning of. This is the human who saved our baby. He's here. He's watching. This is okay. One by one, the others acknowledged him. Sounds, gestures, that same raised hand greeting the baby had learned. Then they went back to their lesson, simply incorporating Marcus into their environment like he was just another part of the forest. Acceptance. They'd accepted him. Marcus sat behind his log for another 2 hours, watching them work and teach and interact. Occasionally, one would glance his way, checking on him, making sure he hadn't moved closer or done anything threatening. The baby kept looking back and grinning, actual grinning, showing teeth in what was clearly happiness rather than aggression. Eventually, they finished their activity, gathered their tools, and prepared to leave. The mother approached Marcus again, stopped at the respectful distance she'd established. She made a series of sounds, pointed at him, pointed at the forest, made a gesture Marcus interpreted as go. Not threatening, inviting. You can walk with us. Marcus shook his head slowly, pointed back the way he'd come. I should head back, but thank you. Thank you for letting me see this. The mother seemed to understand. She reached into her pouch, pulled out something small, and tossed it to Marcus underhand. He caught it reflexively. It was a carved figure of a tree, maybe 6 inches tall, with incredible detail down to individual leaves and bark texture. But carved into the trunk was something new, symbols, not pictures, but something more abstract. Marks that might have been language, written language, or might have been decorative. Marcus couldn't tell. This is beautiful, Marcus said, holding it carefully. Thank you. The mother touched her chest, touched the tree carving in Marcus's hands, pointed at the forest around them. Message received. We share this place. You're part of it now. Then she made one more sound, the same melodic call she'd made the night she took her baby home. Family. Never forgotten. Love. The group disappeared into the forest, the baby looking back one last time to wave, actually wave, hand moving side to side in pure learned human gesture, before vanishing into the trees. Marcus sat there until sunset, holding the carved tree, crying quiet tears of wonder and gratitude and connection, so profound it hurt. He'd come to these mountains to hide from life, to survive grief, to exist in isolated stasis until time ran out. Instead, he'd found family, found purpose, found evidence that the world was bigger and stranger and more beautiful than any textbook had ever suggested. Found proof that love was the most powerful force in nature, strong enough to cross species, to bridge impossible gaps, to connect beings that had no evolutionary reason to care about each other. David had been right all along. Some things didn't need to be understood. Some things just needed to be felt. Marcus hiked back to his cabin as stars emerged, mind full of everything he'd witnessed, heart full of everything he'd felt. He didn't write any of it down that night. Some moments were too sacred for documentation, too profound for analysis. He just sat on his porch with the carved tree in his hands and whispered thank you to the forest, knowing somehow they'd hear it. The summer continued in a rhythm Marcus had never imagined possible. He'd hike into the wilderness 3, sometimes 4 times a week, and more often than not, he'd find signs they'd been there recently. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses, a figure moving between trees, a hand raised in greeting before disappearing. Once he found the whole group at a different creek, and they let him watch for hours as they taught the juveniles how to fish. They were showing him their world, their culture, their way of being, not aggressively, not seeking anything from him, just sharing. Like neighbors getting to know each other over the fence, except the fence was 10,000 years of parallel evolution. August brought something unexpected. Marcus was at his usual spot by the creek when the baby, teenager now, really approached alone. No mother, no group, just him. He settled down next to Marcus with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up knowing he was safe here. They sat together in companionable silence for a while, watching water flow over rocks, listening to birds sing. Then the teenager pulled out a flat stone and something that looked like charcoal made from burned wood. He started drawing on the stone. Simple pictures at first. Trees, animals, the Sunday, then something more complex. He drew two figures, one furry and one not, sitting side by side exactly like they were right now. Then he offered the charcoal to Marcus. Marcus took it with shaking hands, drew his own addition to the picture, a heart between the two figures. Clumsy, simplistic, but clear in meaning. The teenager looked at it for a long moment. Then he made a sound Marcus had learned, meant happiness, approval. Carefully took the stone and put it in a small pouch he'd started carrying, learned behavior, probably taught by his mother. They sat together until the sun started setting, communicating more in silence than words ever could. When the teenager finally stood to leave, he touched Marcus's shoulder gently, the first time he'd initiated physical contact since he'd been hurt. Then he bounded off into the forest, young and strong and alive, leaving Marcus sitting by the creek thinking about connection and teaching and how love worked in ways that transcended every boundary evolution had created. September brought the first hints of fall, leaves starting to turn, air getting crisp. Marcus knew winter would come soon, would make the mountains less accessible, would push the Bigfoot family deeper into their territory, where they'd be safer from weather and humans. He started thinking about legacy, about what happened when he died, because he was 54 now, in decent shape, but getting older, and these mountains were unforgiving. What happened to all this knowledge, all these connections, if he keeled over from a heart attack on some remote trail? He couldn't publish. That would bring researchers, hunters, government agencies, everyone who'd see the Bigfoot family as specimens rather than people. But he also couldn't let this knowledge die with him. So he started writing, not for publication, for preservation. Detailed accounts of every interaction, every observation, every gift exchanged. He wrote about the mother's trust, the baby's recovery, the group's teaching methods, the teenager's drawings. Wrote about what they'd taught him about intelligence and communication and love. He wrote letters too. To David, mostly, even though David was 4 years gone. Told him everything, knowing somehow that David would understand, would appreciate the miracle and mystery and profound beauty of it all. He sealed the letters in waterproof containers, hid them in places only someone who knew where to look would find them. Insurance, maybe, or just processing. Grief and wonder tangled together in ways he was still learning to navigate. October came, and with it the first real snow. Marcus knew the visits would become less frequent now. Knew the family would be focused on survival through winter rather than socializing with the strange human. He made peace with it, grateful for what he'd been given. His last visit of the season came in late October. He hiked out to the canyon one final time before winter made it inaccessible. Left gifts on the usual spot, his best carvings, dried foods, a book he'd been reading about primatology that he thought they might like, even if they couldn't read it, for the pictures, if nothing else. He didn't expect to see them, but as he was leaving, he heard the call, multiple voices, the whole family, singing something that sounded like music. Marcus stopped, turned around. They were there, all of them, standing at the edge of the forest. The mother, the teenager who'd been a dying baby, the others he'd watched all summer. They were singing to him. There was no other word for it. A song of gratitude, of friendship, of see you in spring. Marcus raised his hand in greeting and goodbye. They raised theirs in response. Then they melted into the forest, one last time as snow began to fall harder, leaving Marcus standing in the growing white, with tears freezing on his cheeks and his heart fuller than it had been since David died. Winter hit hard that year, temperatures dropping lower than Marcus had ever seen, snow piling up higher, wind howling through the valley like something alive and angry. He spent long, dark months alone in his cabin, keeping the fire burning, rationing supplies, reading the same books over and over. But he wasn't lonely. Not really. Because now he knew what was out there in the wilderness. Knew a family was surviving the winter in their own way, using knowledge passed down through generations, taking care of each other the way families do. Sometimes, late at night when the wind died down, he'd hear them, distant calls echoing through the mountains, family talking to family across vast distances. And sometimes, he'd call back in his clumsy approximation of their language, and they'd answer. Connection maintained even through the harshest season. Proof that what they'd built together was real and lasting, and strong enough to survive separation. Marcus turned 55 that winter, alone in his cabin, celebrating with extra honey in his tea and a small fire in David's honor. He thought about everything that had changed in the year since a dying baby showed up at his door. He'd started that year as a ghost, a man going through motions while waiting for time to run out. He'd end it as something different, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of impossible secrets, someone who'd learned that family came in forms textbooks never mention. The winter finally broke in late March, snow melting into rushing streams, revealing a forest floor that looked reborn. Marcus emerged from his cabin like a bear from hibernation, restless and eager, needing to know if his family had made it through the harsh season. He hiked out to the canyon on the first day the trail was passable, legs shaky from months of limited activity, pack heavy with gifts he'd spent all winter making. Carved figures of every family member, a necklace he'd woven from plant fibers, using techniques he'd found in anthropology books, dried foods he'd carefully preserved. The meeting spot was empty. Marcus left his gifts and tried not to worry. They were wild people living on their own terms. Just because he was ready for spring didn't mean they'd be waiting at his convenience. He came back 3 days later. The gifts were gone, replaced by a single item that made his breath catch. A carving of Marcus, but different from the others. This one showed him older, grayer, sitting on what was clearly his porch with a book in his lap. And surrounding him, barely visible in the carved shadows, were multiple figures, Bigfoot figures, watching over him, protecting him. The message was clear. We see you aging. We know you're mortal. We're here. Marcus sat down hard on a rock, holding the carving with shaking hands. They understood human lifespans, understood he wouldn't be here forever, and they were telling him it mattered. His life mattered to them. I'm not going anywhere yet, he said to the empty forest. Got too much to stick around for now. The visits resumed in April, careful at first. Like everyone was testing whether the connection had survived winter. Marcus would hike out and find fresh signs, tracks, gifts. Once an entire meal of foraged foods arranged on a flat rock, like they were inviting him to dinner. May brought the first face-to-face meeting of the season. Marcus was at the creek when the teenager appeared, except he wasn't really a teenager anymore. He'd grown again over winter, shot up to maybe 7 feet, filled out through the chest and shoulders, almost adult-sized, though still moving with young energy. Holy shit, look at you, Marcus said, grinning. You're huge. The young Bigfoot made a sound that Marcus had learned was laughter, short, huffing exhalations that shook his whole body. Then he settled down next to Marcus, like they'd just seen each other yesterday instead of 5 months ago. They fell into their old rhythm, sitting together. Marcus talking about his winter, the Bigfoot making sounds Marcus was slowly learning to interpret. Sometimes the Bigfoot would draw pictures in the dirt, showing Marcus things that had happened, a hunt, a cave they'd sheltered in, what looked like some kind of ceremony or celebration. You had a party? Marcus asked, pointing at the drawing of multiple figures in a circle. What were you celebrating? The young Bigfoot touched his own chest, made a complex sound, gestured in a way that Marcus eventually understood. Coming of age. He'd gone through some kind of ritual that marked his transition to adulthood. "I'm sorry I missed it," Marcus said quietly. "Would have brought a gift if I'd known." The young Bigfoot, young man, really, Marcus corrected himself, made a dismissive gesture, then drew something else. Two figures, one human and one Bigfoot, standing side by side with hands clasped. "You were there in spirit. You're always with us." Marcus had to look away, blinking hard against sudden tears. Yeah, you're always with me too." June brought something unprecedented. Marcus was at his cabin, working in his greenhouse, when he heard a sound that made him freeze. A call, close by, from the tree line just beyond his property. The mother, she'd never come this close to his cabin before, had always maintained distance like she was respecting boundaries. Marcus stepped outside slowly. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, and she wasn't alone. The young man was with her, and behind them, partially hidden, were two of the juveniles Marcus had seen before. The mother made a sound, complex, clearly asking permission. "You want to come closer?" Marcus said, heart hammering. "That's... yes, of course." She took a few steps forward, the others following her lead. They spread out slightly, examining Marcus's property with clear curiosity. One of the juveniles crept toward the greenhouse, peered inside at the plants growing there. The other one investigated the woodpile, running hands over the stacked logs, like analyzing how it was constructed. The young man walked straight to Marcus, no hesitation, and held out something. It was a basket, woven from plant fibers, with a skill that would have made any craftsperson jealous, filled with things Marcus recognized. Medicinal herbs, some of the same ones the mother had brought when her baby was dying. "For me?" Marcus asked, taking it carefully. The mother made a sound, gestured in a way Marcus understood. She was teaching him, showing him their plant knowledge, trusting him with information that had probably been kept secret from humans for thousands of years. They spent an hour at his cabin, examining his space, leaving gifts, building trust. The juveniles were fascinated by everything: the solar panels, the greenhouse, the hand tools Marcus used for carpentry. They'd touch things carefully, look to the mother for permission before picking anything up. Marcus brought out some of his reference books, ones with pictures of local plants and animals, showed them to the juveniles, who made excited sounds when they recognized species they knew. One of them pointed at a picture of an elk, then made a gesture Marcus eventually understood. "I've hunted these." Knowledge exchange. They were teaching him, and letting him teach them, building a shared understanding that transcended language barriers. When they finally left, the mother approached Marcus one last time. She placed both hands on his shoulders, gentle despite her strength, and made a sound that resonated in Marcus's chest. Then she touched her forehead to his, just for a moment, a gesture of profound respect and affection. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, "for trusting me, for letting me be part of this." She pulled back, made one more sound, the one Marcus knew meant family, and led her people back into the forest. Marcus stood in his clearing for a long time after they left, hands still holding the basket of herbs, forehead still tingling from her touch. He'd been accepted not just as a curious observer or a helpful stranger, but as part of their community, part of their family. That night, he wrote in his journal with shaking hands, "I came to these mountains to die, not actively, but passively, to fade away from a world that had taken everything I loved. Instead, I found a reason to live that I never imagined possible. They've given me more than I gave them. Infinitely more." Summer became a season of learning. The family visited Marcus's cabin regularly now, sometimes the whole group, sometimes just a few members. They taught him their plant knowledge, which roots were medicinal, which berries were safe, how to identify water sources, showed him how to move through the forest with less noise, how to read weather patterns from cloud formations, how to find caves and shelter spots he'd never noticed. One afternoon in July, the young man brought his own book, not paper, bark, stripped carefully and pressed flat, with drawings and symbols burned into the surface. He showed it to Marcus reverently, like sharing something sacred. It was a history. Their history. Images depicting generations of their people, hunting, gathering, raising children, mourning their dead. Territorial maps showing ranges that stretched across the entire mountain region. Pictures of encounters with humans dating back centuries, some peaceful, many violent, all remembered. And there, near the end, recent additions. A figure that was clearly Marcus, tending to a small wounded figure. The mother watching from shadows. The whole family greeting the human who'd saved one of their own. Marcus was in their history now, part of their collective memory. His actions had been deemed significant enough to record for future generations. I don't have words for what this means, Marcus said, voice breaking. The young man made a sound, understanding, acceptance, pointed at Marcus, pointed at the history bark, touched his chest. You're one of us now, forever. August brought the first signs that something was changing in Marcus. He noticed it slowly, getting winded more easily on hikes, occasional chest tightness that he chalked up to age and altitude, moments where his heart would skip beats in ways that felt wrong. He didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to face what it might mean. He was only 55, relatively healthy, not ready to admit his body might be failing him. But the Forrest family noticed. They always noticed. The mother started bringing him specific herbs, plants Marcus recognized from his medical training as cardiac supportive. She'd gesture at his chest, make concerned sounds, insist he take what she offered. I'm fine, Marcus protested. Just getting older. She made a sound that clearly meant bullshit. You're not fine. Pushed the herbs into his hands with more force than usual. The young man started staying closer during their hikes, adjusting his pace to match Marcus's slower one, checking on him more frequently. The others would bring easily digestible foods, nutrient-dense items that suggested they knew he needed to maintain his strength. They were taking care of him now, the way he'd once taken care of the dying baby. The circle completing itself. By September, Marcus couldn't ignore it anymore. The chest pain was getting worse, more frequent. He'd wake up at night with his heart racing, struggling to catch his breath. He knew what this was. He'd seen the same symptoms in David before the heart attack that killed him. He needed to see a doctor, get on medication, maybe have surgery. But that meant leaving the mountain, going back to civilization, potentially being gone for weeks or months. It meant leaving his family. He tried to explain it to them at their next meeting, pointed at his chest, made gestures about needing human medicine, drew pictures in the dirt of hospitals and doctors, tried to communicate that he'd come back, that this wasn't goodbye. The mother watched him, eyes full of understanding and sorrow. When he finished, she made a long series of sounds, clearly communicating something complex to her family. Then she turned back to Marcus and did something she'd never done before. She took his hand and placed it over her heart. Let him feel it beating, slower than human, steadier, powerful. Then she took her own hand and placed it over his heart, feeling the irregular rhythm, the weakness. Message received, I understand. You're sick, you need help. The young man stepped forward, wrapped Marcus in a hug that was gentle despite his size, held him like something precious that might break, made sounds Marcus recognized as their word for family, repeated over and over. The whole family gathered around him, touching him gently, shoulders, arms, head, in what was clearly a blessing or a prayer or a goodbye that hoped not to be permanent. I'll come back, Marcus promised, tears streaming down his face. I swear to God, if I survive this, I'll come back. The mother made one last sound, pointed at Marcus, pointed at the mountains, touched her chest. This is your home. We'll be waiting. Marcus left for Missoula 2 days later, packing only essentials, leaving everything else in the cabin. He'd carved a figure before he left, all of them together, human and Bigfoot, standing in a circle, and placed it on the meeting stone with a note he knew they couldn't read, but hoped they'd understand the meaning of family forever. I'll return. The drive down the mountain was the hardest thing he'd done since David's funeral. Every mile felt like betrayal, like abandoning the most important thing in his life. But his heart was failing, and dying alone in the woods would mean never seeing them again. The hospital confirmed what he'd feared: severe coronary artery disease, multiple blockages, heart functioning at maybe 60%. They wanted to do bypass surgery. Said without it, he had maybe 6 months, maybe less. When can I go home after surgery? Marcus asked. 6 to 8 weeks recovery minimum. Then, do it. Schedule it now. Soonest possible. He called no one, listed no emergency contacts, faced the surgery alone because he'd burned most bridges when he moved to the mountains, and the only family he cared about couldn't exactly visit a hospital. Went under anesthesia thinking about the mother's hands over his heart, the young man's hug, the promise he'd made to return. The surgery went well. Marcus woke up with new arteries, new plumbing, his heart beating stronger than it had in years. The pain was incredible, recovery brutal, but he pushed through it with singular focus. I have to get back. They're waiting. He spent 6 weeks in Missoula, doing physical therapy, building strength, lying to doctors about having a support system at home. Spent his evenings carving small figures from wood the hospital staff brought him, building his strength and maintaining his connection to the family even across the distance. Late October, against medical advice, and with prescriptions he'd probably never properly take, Marcus drove back up the mountain. The colors were peak fall, everything burning gold and red, the world showing off before winter hit. His cabin was exactly as he'd left it, but the meeting stone was covered in gifts, dozens of them. Carvings, woven items, food, herbs, everything they could think to leave. Proof they'd been checking constantly, waiting for his return, leaving offerings like prayers for his survival. Marcus broke down right there, sitting on the ground, surrounded by proof of love that crossed every boundary. They'd been taking care of him even in his absence, maintaining connection, refusing to forget. He left a gift of his own, a carving of a heart with a crack through it, then symbols representing stitching or repair. I was broken. I'm healing. I'm here. The next morning, he hiked out to the canyon, moving slower than before but determined. His heart was strong now, beating steady, thanks to human medicine and the will to return to family. They were waiting for him, all of them, like they'd known somehow that today was the day. The mother saw him first, made a sound that started low and built into something between a cry and a song, joy and relief, and love so vast it echoed off the canyon walls. She ran to him, actually ran, something Marcus had never seen her do, and dropped to her knees in front of him, touching his face, his chest over his heart, checking that he was real and alive and whole. The young man was right behind her, pulling Marcus into a hug that would have cracked ribs before surgery but was gentle now, measured, careful of his healing body. The others surrounded them, making sounds of celebration, touching Marcus to confirm he was solid and present and return. Marcus sobbed into the young man's shoulder, letting out 6 weeks of fear and loneliness and desperate need to be home. I came back, he said over and over. I promised I'd come back. The mother took his hand, placed it over his chest, feeling the strong, regular heartbeat. Then she placed her hand over his heart, feeling it herself. Made a sound of profound approval and relief. Fixed. You're fixed. You're staying. They spent the day together, celebrating his return in ways that needed no words. Shared food, exchanged gifts, sat in companionable silence while the forest moved around them. When the sun started to set, and Marcus knew he needed to get back before dark, the mother stopped him. She pulled something from her pouch, a necklace she'd clearly spent enormous time creating. Carved wooden pieces interspersed with stones and what looked like small bones, strung on braided plant fiber. Beautiful and intricate beyond description. She placed it around Marcus's neck, settled it against his chest right over his healing heart. Made a series of sounds Marcus understood. Protection, love, welcome home. Thank you, Marcus whispered. For everything, for not giving up on me. She touched his face gently with one massive hand, made the sound that meant family, made another sound, new, one Marcus hadn't heard before, but its meaning was crystal clear in context. Always. Marcus hiked back to his cabin as darkness fell, the necklace warm against his chest, his heart beating strong and steady, his purpose renewed. He'd been given a second chance at life, and he knew exactly what he was doing with it. Staying here, staying with them, learning and teaching and building bridges between worlds until his repaired heart finally gave out for good. November brought early snow, but Marcus was better prepared this year. He'd stocked supplies, winterized the cabin properly, made peace with the isolation, because he knew now it wasn't really isolation at all. The family visited when they could, less frequently as winter deepened, but always leaving signs. Tracks in the snow near his cabin that said, "We're checking on you." Gifts left where he'd find them that said, "We remember you're here." December brought the solstice, the longest night, and Marcus celebrated alone in his cabin with extra fire and thoughts of his family out in the wilderness. Wondered if they marked the solstice too, if they had ceremonies or rituals for the turning of the year. The answer came 2 days after solstice. Marcus woke before dawn to sounds outside his cabin, not threatening, but definitely present. Multiple somethings moving around his property. He grabbed a flashlight, stepped out onto his porch, and stopped dead. They were here. All of them. The whole extended family, more than he'd ever seen together before. Maybe 20 or 25 individuals, ranging from infants, clinging to their mothers to elders with grey-white fur. They'd come down from their high territory, traveled through deep snow, to be here. The mother stepped forward from the group, made a sound that Marcus understood as greeting, as invitation. They were inviting him to something. Marcus grabbed his heavy coat, his boots, everything he needed for cold. Followed them into the forest, trusting completely, his repaired heart beating strong and steady. They led him to a place he'd never been before, a cave system hidden in the canyon walls, large enough for the whole group with room to spare. Inside, the cave was warm from carefully maintained fires, lit by what looked like oil lamps made from hollowed stones. This was their home, their actual dwelling place, and they were showing it to him. The group settled in a large circle, and the mother guided Marcus to a place between her and the young man, position of honor, protected and welcomed. Then they began to sing, all of them, voices blending in harmonies that shouldn't have been possible, but were beautiful beyond description. The song rose and fell, complex and purposeful, clearly telling a story through sound. An elder stepped forward, the same silver-backed male Marcus had seen briefly before, but older than he'd realized, moving with careful dignity. He approached Marcus and placed something in his hands, a staff, carved from a single piece of wood, covered in symbols and images that chronicled everything Marcus had experienced with them. The dying baby, the mother's trust, the healing, the learning, the connection. All of it preserved in wood, a history given physical form. The elder made sounds, long, complex, clearly speaking directly to Marcus. The young man leaned close, tried to translate through gesture and the language they'd built together. "You saved one of us. You kept our secret. You treated us as people, not animals. You are family now, officially and forever. This staff proves it. It gives you status among our people, elder, teacher, honorary member of our tribe." Marcus held the staff with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. They were making him part of their social structure, giving him a role in their society, telling him officially what he'd felt all along. He was one of them now. The ceremony continued with gift-giving, every family member bringing something to add to a pile in front of Marcus. Food, tools, art, medicines, offerings that said you belong here, we provide for you, you're under our protection. When it was Marcus's turn, he gave them what he'd brought, not much, just a few carved figures and some dried foods. But he also gave them something else. He stood, staff in hand, and sang. He'd never sung in his life. David had been the musical one. But he tried anyway, singing old folk songs David had taught him, his voice rough and off-key but honest, singing not because he was good at it, but because they'd sung for him and he needed to return the honor. The family listened in what felt like respectful silence. When he finished, they made sounds of approval, of acceptance, of understanding that he'd tried to speak their language of music, even if he'd butchered it. The mother stood then, approached Marcus, and did something that made his breath catch. She took off a necklace she was wearing, one she clearly had for years, worn and cherished, and placed it around his neck alongside the one she'd given him before. Hers, her personal necklace, given to him, the highest honor she could offer. Marcus took off his own wedding ring, the one he'd worn for 4 years after David died, unable to let go, held it out to her with shaking hands. She understood immediately, took it carefully, examined it, and placed it on her own finger, too small for her, but she wore it anyway. A token from him, equally meaningful, equally significant. They stood there, human and Bigfoot, wearing each other's most precious possessions, and Marcus felt something shift, not loss, but transformation. He'd been holding on to David through that ring, holding on to grief, holding on to the past. Now he was letting go, honoring what was by giving it to someone else who understood its weight, moving forward while still remembering. The ceremony continued late into the night. More songs, more stories told through sounds Marcus couldn't fully understand, but felt in his bones, more connection built through shared presence and attention. When it finally ended, and the family prepared to let Marcus return home, the young man pulled him aside, made a gesture Marcus had seen before, 2 fingers pointed at eyes, then pointing at Marcus. "I see you." Marcus repeated it back, adding his own gesture, hand over heart, then reaching out to touch the young man's chest. "I love you." The young man wrapped him in one more hug, made a sound that was part laugh and part sob, then released him. Marcus hiked back to his cabin through snow and darkness, staff in hand, 2 necklaces around his neck, wedding ring given away to honor the past while embracing the present. His heart beat strong and steady, his purpose crystalline clear. He was home, really, truly home, not just in a place, but in a family, in a community, in a life that mattered. The impossible had become his everyday reality, and there was nowhere else he'd rather be. Now, here's the thing about stories like this. They don't really end. They just keep going, evolving, changing shape over time. Marcus lived another 15 years in those mountains. 15 years of learning and teaching, of bridges built between worlds, of love that transcended every boundary science had ever drawn. The Bigfoot family never forgot him. They incorporated him into their society, their culture, their collective memory. He became their bridge to understanding the human world, just as they became his bridge to understanding that intelligence and consciousness came in forms textbooks never imagined. He documented everything privately, filling journals with observations that would have revolutionized anthropology if he'd ever published them. But he never did. Some knowledge is too dangerous for a world that would cage and study and monetize the miraculous. When Marcus finally died, peacefully, at 70, on his porch at sunrise, staff in hand, surrounded by gifts they'd left the night before like they'd known it was time, the family mourned him the way they'd mourn one of their own. They buried him in their way, in a place they'd never shown him but had prepared for this moment. Placed him with his staff, his carvings, the gifts they'd exchanged over 15 years. Marked his grave with symbols that meant heart healer, bridge walker, friend of the forest people. And they kept his memory alive. Taught their children about the human who'd saved one of them, who'd become part of their tribe, who'd proven that compassion could cross any boundary. Carved his image into their history bark, so future generations would know his story. The cabin still stands, empty now, but maintained somehow. Hikers occasionally report finding it surprisingly clean, with fresh flowers on the porch, like someone's taking care of it. Sometimes they find small carved figures near the trail, or perfectly stacked cairns that weren't there before. And sometimes, very rarely, someone will glimpse something in the trees. A figure too tall, too broad, moving with too much grace, watching, waiting, protecting the memory of the man who proved that love is the most powerful force in nature. So what's the lesson here? What's the takeaway from this absolutely insane story? Maybe it's this. The world is bigger and stranger and more beautiful than we let ourselves believe. Intelligence exists in forms we don't recognize. Love transcends species, transcends logic, transcends everything we think we know about how the universe works. Marcus Chen went to those mountains to die. Instead, he found a reason to live that changed everything. He discovered that grief doesn't end, but can transform into something else. Gratitude for having loved, openness to loving again in unexpected forms. He learned that family isn't defined by DNA or species or anything science can measure. It's defined by who shows up when you're dying, who trusts you with their most precious thing, who remembers you exist when the world forgets, who mourns you when you're gone. The Bigfoot family, if that's even what they were, these intelligent beings that science says don't exist, they taught Marcus that connection is possible across impossible boundaries. That compassion is universal. That love, real love, doesn't care about the rules. And maybe, just maybe, they're still out there, in the Bitterroot Mountains, or the Cascades, or the Olympics, or wherever creatures that shouldn't exist have learned to hide from a world that would destroy them for profit, watching, waiting, protecting their secret, living their lives with intelligence and grace and love that we're too arrogant to acknowledge, building families, teaching their children, creating art, mourning their dead, remembering the rare humans who saw them as people instead of specimens. You know what's wild? After hearing this story, you'll never look at those dark woods the same way. Every unexplained sound, every track that's too big, every tree structure that doesn't quite make sense, you'll wonder. You'll remember Marcus Chen and his impossible family. You'll think about connections that transcend everything we thought we knew. And maybe that's the real magic here. Not whether Bigfoot exists or not, but whether we're capable of recognizing intelligence and consciousness in forms we don't understand. Whether we can choose compassion over fear when the impossible shows up at our door. Marcus made his choice. He opened that door. He saved that baby. He became family with beings that shouldn't exist, and it transformed everything. So next time you're in the mountains, in those deep places where cell phones don't work, and trails peter out, and civilization feels like a distant dream, pay attention. Listen to the silence that isn't really silence. Look for signs that you're not alone. And if something impossible appears, if intelligence looks back at you from a face that isn't human, but isn't exactly not human either, if a mother desperate to save her dying child asks for your help, remember Marcus Chen. Remember that love is the most powerful force in nature. Remember that family comes in forms we never imagined. And maybe, just maybe, choose to open that door. Because on the other side of impossible, there's connection, there's purpose. There's a kind of magic that science can't explain, but hearts understand perfectly. The world needs more bridgewalkers. More people willing to see intelligence in unexpected forms. More humans brave enough to choose compassion when fear would be easier. Marcus Chen proved it's possible. Proved that a grieving professor could become family with forest people. Proved that love transcends every boundary we've ever drawn. His story isn't really over. It lives on in those mountains, in the memories of beings we pretend don't exist, in the possibility that somewhere out there, impossible connections are still being made. And now it lives in you too, in the knowledge that the world is stranger and more beautiful than you ever imagined, in the question of what you'd do if the impossible knocked on your door. Would you open it? Would you choose love over fear? Would you become the kind of person whose memory gets carved into history bark, whose life proved that compassion is stronger than every rule evolution ever wrote? Marcus Chen did. And that, friends, is the wildest, most beautiful, most absolutely insane true story I've ever heard. Even if every word of it is fiction, even if it's all just a story about what could be, what should be, what might be possible if we were brave enough. Sometimes, the truest things are the ones that never happened. Sometimes, the most important stories are the impossible ones. And sometimes, in the deep woods where shadows move wrong and trees break too high and sounds carry intelligence, we refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes, magic is real. You just have to be willing to see it, to believe it, to open that door when it comes knocking. The choice, as always, is yours. Dear friend, every story is a piece of life. And now we continue a wonderful story. I'm about to tell you something a man swore to keep quiet. 50 years quiet. Until now. Might change how you think about those woods, in places you thought you knew. The snow came early that year, 1974. Walter Brennan remembered because he'd just buried his father 2 weeks before, and the ground had still been soft enough to dig. Now, standing at the window of his cabin 40 miles north of Marquette, Michigan, he watched it fall like it meant to erase everything. The logging roads, the stumps, the memories, all of it. The coffee in his mug had gone cold an hour ago, but he held it anyway. Something to do with his hands, something to keep them from shaking. At 62, his hands had started doing things without his permission, trembling when he tried to thread a hook, dropping keys, betraying him in small ways that added up to something bigger he didn't want to name. The woods beyond his window stretched for miles. He'd walked every inch of them over the years, first as a boy with his father, then as a young man proving something to himself, then as a father teaching his own son the difference between deer tracks and moose, between the call of a barred owl and a great horned. Now his son lived in Phoenix, sold insurance, hadn't been back in 3 years. The woods were just his now, his and whatever else lived in them. He'd been hearing things lately. Not the usual sounds he knew, those like he knew his own heartbeat. This was different. A crying that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human, something that made the hair on his neck stand up even though he'd stopped believing in ghost stories 50 years ago. The first time, he'd blamed the wind. Wind could sound like anything, when it wanted to, like a woman screaming, like a train, like the world ending. But this wasn't wind. Wind didn't have rhythm. Wind didn't pause to breathe. Walter set down his mug, the ceramic clicking against the wooden table his grandfather had built, with hand tools and stubbornness. Everything in the cabin had a story. The rifle above the door, his father's, brought back from Korea. The bearskin rug, his own kill, 1962, the year Kennedy almost got us all killed over Cuba. The rocking chair by the fireplace, his wife's, empty now for 7 years. Margaret, even thinking her name was like pressing on a bruise. She'd loved these woods differently than he did, where he saw resources and boundaries and property lines. She saw mystery. There's more out here than you know, Walt, she'd say, standing on the porch in her nightgown, coffee steaming in the morning air. More than anyone knows. He'd laughed at her then. Practical man, practical thoughts. Trees were trees. Animals were animals. The world was what you could see and measure and understand. But lately, since the sound started, he'd been thinking about her words, wondering what she'd known that he'd missed. The crying came again, closer this time. Through the snow, through the walls, through his skin, and into his bones. It was the sound of something lost, something hurt, something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Walter pulled on his boots. The leather cracked and worn, but still waterproof after all these years. His parka hung by the door, heavy canvas that smelled like wood smoke and time. He'd need the rifle, but when he reached for it, his hand stopped. The crying wasn't threatening, it was pleading. Instead, he grabbed the flashlight and his medical kit, the one he'd kept stocked, since Margaret's heart started failing, as if being prepared could stop what was coming. Bandages, antiseptic, morphine he'd never had to use. The weight of it in his pack was familiar, comforting even. The door opened on hinges that screamed in the cold. Snow had already piled a foot deep against the threshold. His breath came out in clouds that the wind tore apart before they could form. The thermometer on the porch read 10 below, but with the wind, it felt like the temperature had negative intentions. The crying was coming from the north, where the old growth started, where the trees were older than the state itself. Walter had always felt small in that part of the forest, like he was walking through a cathedral built before humans figured out language. The snow was falling so thick he could barely see 20 feet ahead, but he knew the way. His feet found the path without his mind needing to guide them. A half-mile in, he stopped. The crying had stopped too. The silence was worse somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. Then he saw the tracks. They were huge, maybe 18 inches long, with toes that spread wide for balance in the snow. But it wasn't the size that made him stare. It was the pattern. Whatever made these tracks walked upright, had a stride that was almost human, but not quite, like someone had taken the idea of walking and interpreted it differently. The tracks led deeper into the old growth, toward the ravine where lightning had split an ancient pine in half last summer. Walter followed, his flashlight beam catching on snow-laden branches that looked like arms reaching for him. The crying started again, weaker now, desperate. He found it at the base of the split pine. At first, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. It was too impossible, too far outside the boundaries of what should exist. A young creature, maybe 3 feet tall, covered in dark fur that was matted with blood. Its face was almost human eyes, too intelligent, nose too flat, mouth that could have been designed for speech if it wanted to be. One of its legs was caught in a trap, one of the old steel jaw types that had been illegal for 20 years, but still rusted in forgotten corners of the forest. The creature looked at him, and Walter felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates moving after being still too long. Those eyes were brown, flecked with gold, and they held pain but also something else. Recognition, maybe, or hope. "Jesus Christ," Walter whispered, and his voice sounded strange in the snowy silence, like it belonged to someone else. The creature made a sound, not quite crying anymore, more like the noise his son used to make when he was small and scared and trying to be brave. It reached out one hand, and it was a hand, not a paw, with fingers and opposable thumbs and fingernails that needed trimming toward him. Walter's rational mind, the mind that had kept him alive through Korea and 40 years of logging and a wife's slow death, told him to run. This was something that shouldn't exist, something that broke the rules, something dangerous. But his hands were already moving, setting down the flashlight, opening the medical kit, pulling out the bolt cutters he'd packed for reasons he couldn't have explained. "Easy now," he said, the way he'd talked to horses and dogs and his son when nightmares came. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." The creature watched him approach, those impossible eyes never blinking. Up close, Walter could smell it, pine sap and wet earth, and something wild, something that had never been inside walls or known domestication. The trap had bitten deep into its ankle, and blood had pooled in the snow, steaming in the cold air. He had to work the bolt cutters 3 times before the steel gave way. The creature cried out once, a sound that went through Walter like electricity, then fell silent. Its ankle was mangled, probably broken, definitely infected. Without thinking, Walter pulled off his parka and wrapped it around the small body. The creature was heavier than it looked, dense with muscle despite its size, and it clung to him with those human not human hands as he lifted it. The walk back to the cabin took forever, and no time at all. The snow had picked up, turning the world into static, into white noise made visible. The creature's breathing was shallow against his chest, and he could feel its heart beating too fast, like a bird's. His own heart was doing something strange too, skipping beats, adding extra ones, drumming out a rhythm that didn't match anything he'd felt before. Inside the cabin, he laid the creature on Margaret's rug by the fireplace. In the warmth and light, he could see it better. It was young, definitely young, with features that were softer than they would be in adulthood. The fur was dark brown, almost black, but with hints of red where the firelight caught it. Its feet were huge compared to its body, like a puppy that would grow into its paws. Walter had set bones before, on hunting trips when things went wrong, on himself once when he'd fallen from a tree stand. This wasn't so different. The creature watched him work, those eyes tracking every movement as he cleaned the wound, set the bone, wrapped it in gauze. It didn't fight him, didn't try to escape. When he offered it water, it drank. When he held out a piece of dried venison, it ate from his hand. That first night, neither of them slept. Walter sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, though he knew he'd never use it, watching the creature breathe by his fire. Sometimes it would make sounds not quite words but close, like it was trying to communicate in a language that hadn't been invented yet. Sometimes it would look at him with those golden brown eyes, and he'd feel that shift again, that sense that the world was bigger and stranger than he'd let himself believe. By morning, the fever had started. The creature's breathing became labored, its skin hot beneath the fur. Walter did what he could, antibiotics from his kit, cool cloths on its forehead, the kind of care he'd given Margaret when the doctors said there was nothing left to do but make her comfortable. On the second day, he heard them. The sounds came from the woods, from all directions at once. Not crying this time, but something else, calls that rose and fell like questions, like searching, like grief. The creature heard them too, tried to sit up, made a sound back that was weak but unmistakable. Walter understood then. This young one had family, had others looking for it. The rational thing would be to put it outside, let them find it, wash his hands of the whole impossible situation. But when he looked at the creature, saw how small it was, how hurt, he couldn't do it. Not yet. He went to the window instead, peered out into the forest that suddenly seemed less familiar than it had that morning. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them, presences just beyond the tree line, waiting, watching. The hair on his neck stood up, but it wasn't entirely fear. It was also awe. That night, the fever broke. The creature's breathing eased, and it slept for the first time, curled on Margaret's rug like it belonged there. Walter dozed in his chair, rifle forgotten, and dreamed of Margaret standing on the porch in her nightgown, smiling like she'd won an argument they'd never actually had. He woke to find the creature sitting up, testing its wrapped ankle. It looked at him when he stirred, and there was something different in its eyes, gratitude, maybe, or understanding. It made a gesture with its hands that was almost like sign language, pointing to itself, then to him, then to the door. "You want to go home," Walter said, and his voice was rough from sleep and something else, something that felt like loss, even though he'd only had this impossible guest for 3 days. The creature nodded, actually nodded, like it understood every word. Walter helped it to its feet. It could stand now, though it favored the injured ankle. He wrapped his parka around its shoulders again, then opened the door to the pre-dawn darkness. The snow had stopped, and the world was silent and silver under a crescent moon. They were there, just beyond the porch, light's reach. He couldn't see them clearly, but he could make out shapes tall, impossibly tall, moving with a grace that seemed wrong for their size. The creature made a sound, and one of the shapes moved closer. Walter's breath caught. It was massive, 8 feet tall at least, covered in the same dark fur as the young one. But its face was what made him grab the doorframe for support. Human and not human, ancient and intelligent, beautiful and terrible all at once. It looked at him, and he felt that look in his bones, in his DNA, in the parts of himself that remembered when humans were prey. But it didn't attack. It reached out, slow and careful, and touched its young one's head. The gesture was so tender, so parental, that Walter felt his eyes burn with tears he hadn't shed since Margaret's funeral. The adult creature looked at him again, and he could have sworn it, nodded. Then it lifted the young one gently, so gently, and melted back into the forest. The others followed, shapes becoming shadows, becoming nothing, until Walter was alone on his porch in the cold, wondering if any of it had really happened. He went back inside, sat in his chair, stared at Margaret's rug where dark fur still clung to the fibers. Real. It had been real. 3 days later, he found it on his porch. A bundle of plants he didn't recognize, tied with grass in a way that was too deliberate to be random. Some of the plants looked medicinal, like the herbs Margaret used to grow, but different, older somehow. There were berries that glowed faintly purple in the morning light, and roots that smelled like earth and rain, and something he couldn't name. He kept them in a jar on the mantel, next to Margaret's picture. Evidence, though he'd never show anyone, proof of something bigger than the world admitted existed. The sounds from the forest changed after that. He still heard them, sometimes calls in the night, footsteps that were too heavy to be bare, breathing outside his windows. But they weren't threatening anymore. They were just there, part of the landscape, part of the mystery Margaret had always known existed. Winter deepened, snow piling higher than he'd seen in decades. He spent the long nights by his fire, sometimes reading, sometimes just listening. The world outside his cabin felt different now, like it had shown him a secret and trusted him to keep it. In February, a blizzard knocked out power to half the county. Walter had his generator, his wood stove, his 40 years of practice being alone, but on the third night of the storm, he heard something at his door. Not knocking, they never knocked, but a presence, waiting. He opened the door to find a deer on his porch. Dead, but fresh, its throat cut clean. No tracks in the snow except his own from that morning. He understood it was a gift, payment maybe, or just neighborly sharing in hard times. He dragged it inside, butchered it like his father had taught him, hung the meat in his cold storage. It lasted him through the rest of the winter. Spring came late that year, ice holding on until May like it didn't want to let go. When the snow finally melted, Walter walked back to the split pine where he'd found the creature. The trap was gone, rust and all, like it had never been there. But there were tracks in the mud, small ones and large ones, a family group maybe, moving through their territory. He started leaving things after that. Salt licks in clearings where he'd seen signs, corn in the harsh weeks of late winter, first aid supplies in a waterproof box near the ravine, bandages, antibiotics, the kind of things that might help if someone, something, got hurt again. The supplies would disappear, replaced sometimes with those strange plants, sometimes with meat, once with a stone that had been worked into the shape of something almost like art. He kept them all, artifacts of an impossible relationship with neighbors who didn't officially exist. His son called less and less. The town got smaller, younger families moving away, older ones dying off. But Walter didn't feel alone anymore. He felt like he was part of something, keeper of a secret, guardian of a border between worlds. At night, sitting by his fire, he'd think about Margaret and wonder if she'd known all along. If her stories about the mysteries in the woods had been more than stories, if she'd been preparing him for this, for after she was gone, so he wouldn't be alone. The young creature came back once, though it wasn't young anymore. Walter was splitting wood on an autumn afternoon, his 70-year-old body moving slower but still moving, when he felt eyes on him. He turned to find it standing at the edge of the clearing, taller now, filled out, but those eyes still the same gold-flecked brown. They looked at each other for a long moment, two beings who shouldn't have been able to share space, but did anyway. The creature raised one hand, a wave or a salute, or a blessing. Walter couldn't tell. Then it was gone, melted back into the forest like it had never been there at all. That winter, the calls in the night sounded different. Younger voices mixed with the old ones. New generation, Walter thought, and felt something like pride, though he had no right to it. He started writing everything down after that. Not to share, he'd made a promise without words that he intended to keep, but to remember, to make it real on paper the way it was real in his mind. He wrote about the creature's eyes, about the weight of it in his arms, about the way the adult had looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. His hands shook more now, the tremor that had started in his 60s becoming a constant companion in his 70s. But he could still write, still remember, still keep the secret. One morning, checking his trap line, even though he rarely trapped anymore, he found another young one. This one wasn't hurt, wasn't caught, was just there sitting in the snow, watching him with curious eyes. It was smaller than the first one had been, maybe 2 feet tall, covered in fur that was more red than brown. Walter squatted down, his knees protesting, and extended his hand. The young creature sniffed it, then grabbed his finger with one small hand. The grip was strong, stronger than a human child's would be, but gentle too. They stayed like that for a moment, connected across species, across impossibility, across all the rules that said this couldn't be happening. Then the forest rustled, and the young one let go, scampering back toward the sound. Walter caught a glimpse of the adult, the same one maybe from all those years ago, watching from between the trees, protecting but not interfering, trusting, maybe, or just curious about the old human who kept their secret. Walter stood, bones creaking like old wood, and nodded to the forest. The forest, somehow, seemed to nod back. He walked home through snow that was just beginning to fall, thinking about Margaret, about mysteries, about the way the world was so much bigger than most people let themselves believe. His cabin came into view through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney, looking exactly like it had for 40 years. But he saw it differently now, not as a lonely outpost, but as a bridge, a place where two worlds touched without quite meeting. Inside, he made coffee, sat in his chair, picked up his journal to write about the new young one. His hands shook, making his writing barely legible, but he kept going. Someone should know, even if that someone was just paper and ink. The calls started as the sun set, echoing through the valley like they did every night now, not threatening, not searching, just present. Just reminding him that he wasn't alone, that the forest was full of life he'd never fully understand. He thought about the trap, about the choice he'd made to help instead of run, about how different his life might have been if he'd chosen fear over compassion. But he hadn't. He'd picked up that impossible creature, carried it home, changed both their worlds in ways he was still discovering. Tomorrow, he'd check the place by the ravine, see if the medical supplies needed restocking. He'd leave more corn in the clearing. He'd walk the paths he'd always walked, but with eyes that saw more, knew more, accepted more. But tonight, he'd sit by his fire, listening to the calls in the darkness, feeling the weight of Margaret's absence and the strange comfort of his impossible neighbors. He'd write in his journal, drink his coffee, exist in the space between the world everyone knew and the world that actually was. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, something huge moved through the forest, branches breaking under its weight. But Walter didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't even look up from his writing. Some things didn't need to be seen to be known. Some mysteries were better left mysterious. He wrote until his hands couldn't hold the pen anymore, then set the journal aside and closed his eyes. The calls continued outside, a conversation in a language he'd never speak but had learned to understand. They were out there, had always been out there, would always be out there, and he was here, keeper of their secret, bridge between worlds, an old man who'd learned that the forest was bigger than fear, bigger than understanding, bigger than anything he'd been taught to believe. When he finally slept, he dreamed of Margaret again. She was standing at the edge of the woods, wearing that nightgown, smiling that smile that said she'd known all along. Behind her, shapes moved in the darkness, tall, impossible, beautiful. "I told you," she said in the dream. "There's more out here than you know." "I know now," he told her. "Good," she said. "Keep their secret, Walt. Keep it safe." He woke to moonlight streaming through the window and the sound of something walking on his porch. Heavy steps, careful steps, steps that belonged to something that shouldn't exist. He didn't get up, didn't investigate. Some things were better left alone, better left to the space between known and unknown. The steps moved away, back toward the forest, back toward the mystery. Walter pulled Margaret's quilt up to his chin. She'd made it the year before she died, sewn it with hands that had already started to shake, and listened to the night sounds of a world that was so much stranger and more wonderful than he'd ever imagined. In the morning, there would be tracks in the snow. There would be gifts on the porch or signs in the forest or young ones watching from safe distances. There would be evidence of the impossible, proof that the world had room for mysteries, space for things that didn't fit in any field guide or scientific journal. But for now, in the darkness before dawn, there was just him and the forest and the secret they shared. An old man and an old mystery, existing together in the space between what was supposed to be and what actually was. The wind picked up, setting the walls to creaking, but it was a familiar sound, a safe sound. His cabin had weathered worse storms, would weather more before his time was done. And when that time came, when his body finally gave up its stubborn grip on life, he wondered who would keep the secret. Who would leave supplies by the ravine? Who would understand that the calls in the night were just neighbors checking in? Maybe no one. Maybe the secret would die with him, become legend again, story again, something people talked about but didn't really believe. Or maybe someone else would find a hurt young one, would choose compassion over fear, would discover what he'd discovered, that the world was bigger than human understanding, and that was okay. That was more than okay. That was wonderful. The morning came grey and bitter, the kind of cold that made Walter's rebuilt ankle ache, the one he'd broken the same winter he'd found the young creature. Slipping on ice while checking his trap line, he'd set it himself, alone in the cabin, biting on a leather belt while bones ground back into place. The adult creatures had left medicine on his porch the next day, those strange purple berries that took the pain away better than any morphine. He'd known then that they watched him as much as he watched for them. Now, 20 years after that first encounter, his body was a map of small betrayals. Fingers that couldn't hold a pen steady, eyes that needed glasses to read his own writing, a heart that skipped beats like a scratched record. But he still walked the woods every day, still checked the clearings, still left supplies that disappeared in the night. This morning felt different though. The air had that electric quality that came before big storms, but the sky was clear. The birds were quiet, not the normal quiet of winter, but the careful quiet of creatures that knew something humans didn't. Walter pulled on his boots, the same ones he'd worn that night 40 years ago, resoled 3 times but still holding together. His parka was new. The old one had never come back after he'd wrapped it around the young creature. Sometimes he wondered if they'd kept it, if it meant something to them the way their gifts meant something to him. The trail to the ravine was icy, treacherous for his 82-year-old legs. He'd fallen twice this winter already, laid in the snow waiting for his body to decide if it was broken or just bruised. Both times, he'd felt them watching from the trees, waiting to see if he'd get up on his own. He had, of course. Stubborn ran in his family like height and bad hearts. The medical supply box was empty again, which meant something had been hurt. Winter was hard on all creatures, seen and unseen. He'd packed extra antibiotics this time, stolen from his own prescription, because the doctor in town wouldn't understand why an old man living alone needed so much. There were bandages too, and suture kits, and those pills for pain that he'd been saving. As he knelt to restock the box, his knees cracking like breaking kindling, he heard it, breathing, close and deliberate, not trying to hide. He turned slowly, the way you do when you're old and when sudden movements might mean falling. The adult was there, the same one he'd been seeing for decades now. Its fur had gone silver at the temples. Did they age like humans? He'd never thought to wonder. It stood maybe 15 feet away, closer than it had ever come in daylight. "Morning," Walter said. Because what else do you say to a neighbor you've known for 20 years but never spoken to? The creature tilted its head, and Walter could see intelligence in those eyes that went deeper than any animal he'd ever encountered. It made a gesture with one massive hand, pointing at Walter, then at its own chest, then at the ground between them. "You want me to come closer?" His voice sounded thin in the winter air, old and ready to break. A nod, deliberate, unmistakable. Walter stood, his joints protesting, and took a step forward. Then another. The creature didn't move, just watched him approach with those ancient eyes. Up close, he could see scars in its furrowed wounds, some that looked like bullet marks. How many close calls had it survived? How many humans had shot at shadows in the night? It reached out slowly, giving him time to back away, and placed one enormous hand on his shoulder. The touch was gentle, careful of his fragile human body. Then it pointed into the deeper woods, the direction where the old growth got so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. "You want me to follow you?" Another nod. Walter had lived 82 years by being careful, by thinking things through, by not taking unnecessary risks. But Margaret had been dead for 27 years. His son hadn't called in 6 months. And what was left to be careful for? What was he saving himself for, if not this? "Lead on then," he said. They walked for an hour, maybe more. The creature moved slowly, matching its pace to Walter's arthritic shuffle. Sometimes it would pause, look back, wait for him to catch his breath. The forest got older as they went, trees so large that 6 men holding hands couldn't circle them. The snow was less here, caught in the canopy above, and the ground was soft with centuries of fallen needles. Finally, they reached a grove that felt different from the rest of the forest. The trees here were arranged almost deliberately, forming a rough circle maybe 100 feet across. In the center was something Walter's mind couldn't quite process at first. Structures made of woven branches and mud, shaped like domes, clearly made rather than random. Homes. They had homes, and they were there. All of them. Walter counted at least 12, ranging from massive adults to young ones the size of human children. They stood among their shelters, watching him with those impossible eyes, waiting to see what he'd do. The one who'd brought him made a sound complex, modulated, almost like language. The others responded, sounds that had grammar, had meaning, had intent. They were talking about him, he realized, discussing the human they'd allowed into their secret place. One of the young ones broke from the group, approaching with that curiosity that young things have regardless of species. Walter recognized the gait, the color of the fur, the slight limp that favored the left leg. It was the first one, the one he'd saved 40 years ago, grown now, maybe with young ones of its own. It stopped just out of reach and made a gesture Walter had seen beforehand to chest, then extended toward him. He'd seen his grandfather make the same gesture once, to a Ojibwe elder at a trading post. Respect, recognition, gratitude. Walter repeated the gesture, his trembling hand barely cooperating. The creature's face changed, not a smile exactly, but something that served the same purpose. That's when he noticed the others, hung from poles around the grove, wrapped in what looked like deer hide, human things. His old parka, carefully preserved, empty bottles that had held antibiotics, the waterproof box he'd left supplies in years ago. They'd kept them all, made them part of their space, turned his gifts into something like shrine markers. "You kept them," he said, and his voice broke on the words. The large one, the elder maybe, made a sound that wasn't quite words but carried meaning anyway. "Yes, yes, we kept them. Yes, they matter. Yes, you matter." Walter's legs gave out then, not from injury but from the weight of it all. He sat hard on a fallen log, and the young ones crept closer, curious about this strange, fragile creature that leaked water from its eyes. He stayed there for hours, watching them live. They had tools, rough-carved but effective. They had language, complex and musical. They had families, the young ones playing while adults worked, preparing food, maintaining shelters. They had culture, traditions, a way of being that had nothing to do with human civilization and everything to do with survival and community. As the sun started to sink, painting the grove gold through the canopy, the elder approached him again. It carried something wrapped in leaves, more of those purple berries, the ones that helped with pain. But there was something else, too. A small figure carved from wood, no bigger than his thumb. It was crude but recognizable. A human figure, bent with age, walking with a stick. Him. They'd carved him. Walter took it with shaking hands, turned it over, saw the care in every cut mark. "Thank you," he said, though the words weren't enough, would never be enough. The elder pointed to the figure, then to the grove, then made a spreading gesture with its arms. Understanding came slowly, the way it does when you're trying to think in a language that doesn't have words. "You want me to know I'm welcome here," Walter said, "that I'm part of this somehow." The elder touched its chest, then Walter's, then gestured to all of them, the whole grove, the whole impossible family, together, connected. Not the same, but part of something shared. They led him back as darkness fell, two of the younger ones carrying torches made from pine resin and branches. The fire cast moving shadows that made the forest seem alive, which Walter supposed it was, had always been, in ways he was only now beginning to understand. At the edge of his property, they stopped. The elder reached out again, touched his shoulder one more time, gentle as falling snow. Then they were gone, melted back into the darkness, like they'd never been there at all. Only the carved figure in his pocket proved it had been real. Inside his cabin, Walter sat in Margaret's chair for the first time since she'd died. It felt different now, less like betrayal and more like coming home. He set the carved figure on the mantel next to her picture, next to the jar of strange plants, next to all the evidence of a life lived adjacent to mystery. His journal entry that night was longer than usual, his shaking hands struggling with every word, but he needed to get it down while it was fresh. The grove, the shelters, the way they'd kept his gifts like treasures, the carving that meant he belonged to something bigger than himself. Spring came eventually, as it always did, ice giving way to mud, silence giving way to birdsong. Walter's garden grew wild that year. He was too tired most days to tend it properly. But vegetables appeared on his porch anyway, plants he didn't recognize, but that tasted like the memory of better times. They were feeding him now, the way he'd fed them. The circle completing itself. His son finally called on a Tuesday in July. "Dad, I'm worried about you up there alone." "I'm not alone," Walter said, and meant it. "What? Did you get a dog or something?" "Something like that." "Look, I've been thinking, maybe it's time you moved down here. We've got that spare room, and Phoenix has great medical facilities." "No." The word came out harder than he'd meant. "No, thank you. This is where I need to be." "Dad, you're 82. What if you fall? What if something happens?" Walter looked out the window to where something moved between the trees, keeping watch, always keeping watch. "Someone would help," he said. "Someone always helps." His son sighed, that sound of adult children who think their parents have gone soft in the head. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, then said goodbyes that felt like practice for a bigger goodbye coming soon. That night, the calls were different, softer, closer, almost like lullabies. Walter lay in bed listening to them, his heart doing its irregular dance, his breathing shallow but steady. He thought about the grove, about belonging, about Margaret saying there was more in the woods than anyone knew. In August, during the hottest week of summer, he collapsed in his garden. One moment he was picking tomatoes, the next he was on the ground, his chest feeling like someone had parked a truck on it. Heart attack, his rational mind said. This is how it ends. But it didn't end. He woke in his own bed, confused, disoriented. His chest still hurt, but it was manageable. There were leaves on his pillow, those medicinal plants they'd given him. The taste of purple berries was still on his tongue. His door was open, had been opened from the outside, and there were tracks on his floor. Large tracks, impossible tracks. They'd brought him in. They'd saved him. The doctor in town, when Walter finally drove himself in a week later, was baffled. "You definitely had an event," he said, looking at the EKG results. "But there's no damage. It's like your heart started to fail, and then just didn't. I've never seen anything like it." Walter thought of purple berries, of ancient medicine, of knowledge that existed outside human understanding. "Lucky, I guess," he said. "More than lucky, miraculous. But you need to be careful. Next time, you might not be so fortunate. Next time." Because there would be a next time. His body was wearing out like an old machine, parts failing one by one. But not yet. Not quite yet. Fall arrived with unusual beauty that year. The maples turning red as blood, the oaks going gold like treasure. Walter walked the woods slower now, often stopping to rest, but still walking, still checking the clearings, still maintaining the connection. He found the young one, a new young one, smaller than any he'd seen before, playing near the creek that marked his property line. It was alone, which was unusual. They never left the young ones alone. Then he heard it, a sound he recognized from 40 years ago. crying but adult-sized, desperate. He followed the sound, the young one trailing behind him like a puppy, and found her, a female, caught in a modern trap, one of those cable snares that tightened the more you fought. She was massive, 7 feet at least, and her eyes were wild with pain and fear. The cable had cut deep into her wrist, and blood ran freely down her arm. "Easy," Walter said, approaching slowly. "Easy now. I'm going to help." She bared her teeth, impressive teeth, designed for more than just plants, but didn't lunge. The young one made sounds at her, soft and reassuring, and she seemed to calm slightly. Walter's hands shook worse than ever as he worked, trying to find the release mechanism on the snare. His fingers wouldn't cooperate, fumbling with the metal, slipping on the blood. The female watched him, those intelligent eyes tracking his every move. Finally, the cable released. She pulled her arm free, cradling it against her chest. The wound was bad, down to bone in places. Without antibiotics, it would go septic. Without treatment, she would die. "Wait here," Walter said, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. Just wait. He hurried as much as an 82-year-old man could hurry back to his cabin. His medical kit was well stocked, had always been well stocked since that first night. He grabbed it all, including the surgical sutures he'd been saving and the last of his strong antibiotics. When he got back, she was still there, the young one pressed against her side. She let him approach, let him clean the wound with shaking hands, let him suture the worst of it closed. She even took the antibiotics when he offered them, seemed to understand they were medicine. As he worked, others arrived. First one, then 3, then a dozen, surrounding them in a loose circle. Protecting or watching, Walter couldn't tell. Maybe both. The elder was among them, silver-furred and stooped, moving like its bones hurt too. When he finished, his hands covered in blood, his whole body trembling from effort, the female reached out with her good hand and touched his face. The gesture was so gentle, so human, that Walter felt tears come again. "You're welcome," he whispered. They helped her stand, 2 adults supporting her weight. The young one lingered, looking between its family and Walter, then did something that stopped his heart for a beat. It hugged him, small arms around his waist, face pressed against his belly, just for a moment. Then it scampered after the others, leaving Walter alone in the forest with blood on his hands and something breaking apart in his chest that wasn't his heart. That night, he dreamed of Margaret again. She was young in this dream, the way she'd been when they'd first married, when the future seemed endless and full of possibility. "You did good, Walt," she said. "I'm tired, Maggie. I'm so damn tired." "I know, but not yet." "Not quite yet." "How do you know?" She smiled, that smile that had made him fall in love 57 years ago, because there's still work to do, still secrets to keep, still bridges to tend. He woke to find his porch covered in gifts, plants, berries, carved figures, stones polished smooth by the river. But more than that, there were prints in the frost, dozens of them, all around his cabin. They'd all come. The whole grove had come to say, "What? Thank you. Goodbye." Both. Winter came early again. October snow that stuck. November ice that turned the world into glass. Walter moved through his days like he was underwater, everything slow and deliberate, and slightly unreal. His journal entries got shorter, his handwriting worse. Some days he couldn't write at all, just sat holding the pen, willing his fingers to work. The calls at night were constant now, checking on him, he thought, making sure he was still breathing. Some nights he'd wake to find his fire built up, wood added while he slept. Some mornings there would be food on his table, not gifts on the porch, but inside, placed carefully where he'd find them. They were taking care of him the way he'd taken care of them. On a night in December, when the thermometer read 20 below and the wind screamed like the world was ending, his heart did its stuttering dance and didn't find the rhythm again. He felt it happening, felt everything slowing down, felt the edges of his vision going dark. But he wasn't afraid. He made it to the door, managed to open it despite fingers that wouldn't close properly. The cold hit him like a physical thing, stealing what little breath he had left. He took 2 steps onto the porch, then his legs gave out completely. They were already there, as if they'd been waiting, as if they knew. The elder knelt beside him. When had it gotten so old? Its fur was more silver than dark now, its movements careful and pained. It lifted Walter's head gently, cradled it in one massive hand. "It's okay," Walter whispered, though his voice was barely sound. "It's okay. Keep the secret. Keep it safe." Others emerged from the darkness. The female he'd saved, her arms scarred but functional. The young one from 40 years ago, middle-aged now, with young ones of its own. They surrounded him, their warmth blocking the wind, their presence making the cold seem less important. Walter reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, pulled out the carved figure they'd given him. He pressed it into the elder's hand, closed those massive fingers around it. "For the next one," he managed. "For whoever comes next." The elder made a sound, low and mournful, like the earth itself grieving. Others took it up, a chorus that rose and fell like waves, like breathing, like the rhythm of life itself. Walter's vision was narrowing, darkness creeping in from all sides, but he could still see them, still see their eyes, intelligent and sad and grateful. Still see the snow beginning to fall, covering everything in white, making the world clean and new again. "Margaret," he said, or thought he said. "Maggie, I kept it safe." The last thing he felt was being lifted, careful hands carrying him like he'd once carried that young one, like he was precious, like he mattered. The last thing he heard was their voices, singing now in their impossible language, marking his passing in their own way. They found him in his bed 3 days later, when the mailman noticed the mail piling up. The coroner said he'd died peacefully, probably in his sleep. Natural causes. An old man whose heart simply stopped. Nobody mentioned the fresh firewood stacked inside, enough for weeks. Nobody mentioned the strange plants on his mantle or the carved figures that didn't match any known art style. Nobody mentioned the tracks around his cabin, too large to be bear, too human to be animal. His son came up from Phoenix to handle the estate. He found the journals, 40 years of them, but dismissed them as the fantasies of a lonely old man. He donated them to the local historical society, along with everything else, kept only Margaret's picture and his father's rifle. The cabin sold to a young couple from Minneapolis, looking for a vacation home. They lasted 1 winter. The sounds in the night, they said. The feeling of being watched, the way things would move when they weren't looking. It sold again, then again. Now it sits empty, slowly returning to the forest, boards warping, roof caving in. But sometimes, hunters passing through report seeing smoke from the chimney. Sometimes they find fresh medical supplies in a waterproof box near the ravine. Sometimes they hear crying in the night, young and scared and impossible. The elder still lives, older now than the mountains, it seems. It keeps the carved figure on a pole in the grove, next to scraps of canvas from an old parka, next to medicine bottles that once held antibiotics. Evidence of a bridge between worlds, of a friendship that shouldn't have existed but did. Sometimes young ones ask about the human things, and the elder tells them in their wordless way about the old man who kept their secret, who helped when he could have harmed, who chose wonder over fear. It's become legend among them, passed down like their other stories, their other mysteries. And sometimes, on winter nights, when the snow falls like forgiveness and the moon turns the forest silver, they still call out, not searching now, not warning, but remembering, honoring, keeping watch over a secret that was never just theirs, but belonged to anyone brave enough to believe that the world was bigger than what we let ourselves see. The forest keeps its secrets, always has, always will, but sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can hear them singing in the darkness. You can hear them remembering an old man who saved a young one, who kept their secret for 40 years, who died knowing he was not alone. Sometimes, that's all any of us can hope for. To be remembered, to have mattered, to have been part of something bigger than ourselves, even if that something was impossible, especially if it was impossible. The wind still carries their calls through the valley, across the lakes, into the dreams of people who will wake and dismiss them as imagination. But somewhere, maybe, someone else will hear them differently. Someone else will choose compassion over fear. Someone else will discover that the world has room for mysteries, for bridges between what we know and what we'll never understand. The secret continues. The forest remembers. The mystery endures. And in a grove where ancient trees form a circle, where structures that shouldn't exist shelter beings that can't be real, a carved figure the size of a thumb stands witness to the truth that sometimes, just sometimes, love transcends species, kindness transcends fear, and the impossible becomes the only thing that ever really mattered at all. The snow falls, the seasons turn, the secret keeps itself, protected by those who understand that not everything needs to be explained, that not every mystery needs solving, that sometimes the most human thing we can do is accept that we share this world with others who have just as much right to its shadows as we have to its light. Walter Brennan's grave is in the town cemetery, a simple stone with his name and dates, nothing more. But if you know where to look, if you visit in the early morning when the mist rises from the ground like spirits, you might find strange plants growing there. Plants that don't belong in any field guide, plants that bloom purple in the snow. The people in town don't talk about it. Some things are better left unspoken. Some mysteries are meant to be mysteries. Some secrets are worth keeping forever, but they know. In the way that small towns know things, without saying them, they know that something walks in their forests that doesn't walk anywhere else. They know that Walter Brennan knew more than he ever said. They know that on certain nights, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, you can hear singing in a language that predates words. They know, and they keep the secret too, in their own way. By not looking too hard at tracks that don't make sense, by not investigating sounds that shouldn't exist, by letting the forest keep what's always been its own. This is how mysteries survive. Not through proof or evidence or scientific discovery, but through the quiet agreement of people who understand that some things are too important to expose to the harsh light of explanation. Through the choice, made again and again, to let wonder exist in the spaces between what we know and what we'll never understand. The forest stands, the secrets hide, the mystery endures. And somewhere, in the darkness between the trees, something impossible watches and waits and remembers an old man who chose love over fear, who kept a promise he never had to make, who proved that humans, sometimes, can be trusted with the truth. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.